My Uncle Cole left me his hunting cabin when he passed in October of 2019. The lawyer who read the will was a thin man with watery eyes who kept clearing his throat between sentences, and when he got to the part about the property, he paused longer than he needed to. He slid a manila folder across the desk and said, almost apologetically, that the deed came with coordinates instead of an address because the cabin sat off a logging road the county had stopped maintaining sometime in the early 80s. He told me to be careful out there. I remember thinking that was a strange thing for a lawyer to say. I'd only been to that cabin twice in my life, both times as a boy. My memories of it were the soft, half-formed kind that children carry, more feeling than image. I remembered the smell of wood smoke clinging to my uncle's flannel. I remembered him teaching me how to clean a squirrel on the porch rail, his big hands moving slow so I could follow. I remembered the way the woods around the cabin got quiet at dusk, the kind of quiet that wasn't empty but full, like something was listening. I hadn't thought about that quiet in 20 years. Not until I was driving up Route 219 with the folder on the passenger seat and the trees closing in around the road like a tunnel. Pocahontas County in late October has a particular kind of beauty that doesn't translate to photographs. The ridges fold over each other in shades of rust and bone, and the fog sits low in the hollows even at noon. I turned off the highway onto a gravel road, then off the gravel onto a dirt cut that wasn't on any map I could find, only on the hand-drawn directions my uncle had paperclipped to the deed. The truck bottomed out twice. I passed the rotted skeleton of a logging trailer, with saplings growing up through its frame, and I knew I was close. The cabin came into view the way I half remembered it, sitting in a clearing maybe a quarter-acre wide, with the ridge rising up behind it, and a creek I could hear but not see. The crooked porch, the green tin roof, gone dull with 20 years of pine sap and weather, the rusted weather vane on the gable, shaped like a rooster, 1 foot bent, so it always pointed slightly north of true. I sat in the truck for a minute with my hands on the wheel, and I felt something I didn't expect, which was grief, the kind that doesn't announce itself, just arrives. And then I looked to my left, and I saw the other cabin. It stood maybe 60 yards from the first, set back a little closer to the tree line. The crooked porch, the green tin roof, the rusted weather vane with the bent foot. It was the same cabin. Not a similar cabin, the same one. Every warped board, every patch of moss on the shingles, every angle of the chimney stones. I sat there with the engine ticking, and I stared at it for a long time, because my brain was trying to make it make sense, and it wouldn't. I got out of the truck. I walked the perimeter of the clearing. I pulled the survey map out of the folder and unfolded it on the hood, and I checked the property lines 3 times. There was one structure listed. One, a single black rectangle on the map, set near the eastern edge of the parcel. But when I lifted my eyes from the paper, there were 2 of them, identical as a reflection, and the air between them felt wrong in a way I couldn't put a word to. Heavy, like the air before a storm, except the sky was clear. I had no cell signal at the cabin, so I drove back down the logging road, maybe 2 miles, until the bars came back. And I called the county recorder's office in Marlinton. I told the woman who answered who I was and where I was and what I was looking at. She asked me to repeat the coordinates. I did. She was quiet for a long moment, and I could hear her typing, and then the typing stopped. When she spoke again, her voice had changed. It had gone careful in the way people's voices go careful when they're choosing their words, she told me. There had been a second structure on that parcel at one time. She told me it had been condemned in 1978 after what she called an incident, and that the county had demolished it the same year. She said the foundation had been broken up and hauled out. She said there shouldn't be anything standing there but a depression in the ground. I asked her what she meant by an incident, and she said she wasn't at liberty to discuss it over the phone. And then she asked me, very quietly, if I was alone out there. I told her I was. She said I should not go inside the second cabin under any circumstance. She said it twice. Then she said she had to go, and the line went dead. I drove back. I don't know why. I think part of me wanted to prove to myself that I'd misread the situation, that there was some trick of the light, or the angle, that when I came over the rise, I'd see only one cabin and laugh at myself. But when I came over the rise, there were still two, and now I noticed something I hadn't noticed before. Because the light had shifted while I'd been gone, and the shadows had gotten longer. The second cabin's chimney was smoking. It wasn't much. A thin gray ribbon, the kind you get from a fire that's been burning a while and settled into its coals. But it was there, and it was steady, and the air around it shimmered the way air does above heat. I parked the truck farther back this time, near the tree line on the opposite side, and I sat there watching that smoke rise for what must have been 10 minutes. The windows of the second cabin were dark. No light inside, no movement behind the glass. Just that smoke climbing up into the October sky like someone was home. I should have left right then. I know that now, the way you always know things after. But there's a stubbornness that runs in my family, a thing my uncle had, and my father had, and I have too, and it wouldn't let me get back in the truck without seeing. So I walked across the clearing, slow. The grass was wet from the morning, and it soaked through my boots. I kept my eyes on the windows the whole time, looking for any flicker behind the dark glass. And there was nothing, just my own pale reflection, getting bigger as I came closer. I got within maybe 20 feet of the porch, and that's when I heard the humming. It was coming from inside. A man's voice, low and tuneless, humming something that wasn't quite a melody, but wasn't quite random either. It was the way someone hums when they're working with their hands and not paying attention to the sound coming out of their mouth, and I knew it. God help me, I knew it. It was the song my uncle used to hum when he cleaned his rifles on the porch, the one he said he'd learned from his own father, the one I'd heard 1,000 times as a boy, sitting on the steps next to him with a cleaning rag in my lap. He never had words for it. He said it didn't have any. He just hummed it. I stopped where I was. I couldn't make my legs go forward, and I couldn't make them go back. The humming kept on, slow and patient, and underneath it I could hear something else now. A soft metallic sound, the small clean noise of a bolt being worked on a rifle. Back and forth, back and forth. Whoever was in there was cleaning a gun. I don't remember walking back to the truck. I remember being in it. I remember my hands shaking so badly, I couldn't get the key into the ignition the first 2 times. I remember driving down that logging road faster than was safe, the truck bouncing hard enough to lift me off the seat. And I remember not looking in the rear-view mirror because I was afraid of what I might see in it. I got a room at a motel in Marlinton. The man behind the desk asked if I was all right, and I realized I must have looked bad, because he gave me the room without making me fill out the card. I sat on the edge of the bed for a long time with the lights on. I didn't sleep. Around 3 in the morning, I called the sheriff's office and told the deputy on duty that I needed someone to come out to my property with me in the morning. I told him there had been a trespasser. I didn't tell him the rest. The deputy who met me at the diner the next morning was a young man named Burdett, soft-spoken, with the kind of patient face people in that part of the country where, when they've seen things they don't talk about. He followed me up the logging road in his cruiser. The sun was out, the sky was the hard blue of late autumn, and I remember thinking that whatever I'd seen the day before couldn't survive that kind of light. I remember being almost cheerful about it, in the brittle way you get when you haven't slept. We came over the rise into the clearing, and I stopped the truck, and I got out. There was only one cabin. Burdett walked the property with me. He was thorough. He checked the doors and the windows. He looked in the woodshed and the outhouse. He walked the perimeter of the clearing, and he stood for a long time. At the spot where the second cabin had been, where the grass grew differently than the grass around it, in a rectangle of pale, thin growth that I hadn't noticed the day before, because the second cabin had been standing on top of it. He didn't say anything about that rectangle. He just looked at it. I told him what I'd seen. I told him about the smoke and the humming and the sound of the bolt. He listened without interrupting. When I was done, he was quiet for a while, and then he said that grief did strange things to people, and that I'd had a long drive, and that the light up here played tricks. He said it kindly. He wasn't dismissing me. He was offering me a way to fold the experience up small enough to carry. I let him. But before we left, I walked over to the rectangle of pale grass one more time, because I wanted to see it in the light. And that's when I saw the boot prints. They started in the middle of the rectangle, where the doorway of the second cabin would have been, and they led out across the clearing toward the tree line. Heavy prints, the kind a working man's boot leaves, the heel deeper than the toe. There was no return trail. They went into the woods, and they did not come back. Burdett saw them too. He stood next to me, and he looked at those prints for a long time, and his patient face got a little less patient, and he didn't say anything about grief anymore. And in the dirt at the start of the trail, half pressed into the soil by the heel of the first boot print, was a brass shell casing. I picked it up before Burdett could tell me not to. It was a .30-06, the kind my uncle had hunted with all his life, and the brass was dull and weathered, the patina of decades on it. I turned it over in my palm. On the side, scratched into the metal with the point of a knife, in the careful, slanted way my uncle had carved everything he owned, were his initials. C.J.M. Cole Jackson Mills. The same initials I'd seen on the stock of his rifle, on the handle of his hunting knife, on the inside cover of the Bible my aunt had buried him with. He'd carved that casing 30 years before he died. I knew because I'd watched him do it on the porch of the cabin the summer I was 9. He'd handed it to me afterward and let me hold it, warm from his hand, and he'd told me that a man should mark the things that belonged to him so they'd find their way home. Then he'd taken it back and dropped it in the tin can. He kept his spent brass in, and I hadn't seen it again until it was in my palm, in the cold light of an October morning, in a clearing where a cabin had stood the day before and didn't stand anymore. I kept the cabin. I don't go up there often. When I do, I go in the middle of the day, and I leave before the light starts to change. I've never seen the second cabin again, and I've never heard the humming, but sometimes, when the wind comes down off the ridge a certain way, I think I can smell wood smoke that isn't coming from my chimney. I haven't gone looking for where it comes from. I don't think I want to know who marked their way home, or what's still walking out there past the tree line, or whether the thing that was humming my uncle's song was something that had taken him, or something he had become. I keep the shell casing in a drawer by my bed. Some nights I take it out and hold it in my palm, and I think about how warm it was the first time he handed it to me, and how cold it was the second. I bought the cabin in the spring of 2017 for almost nothing, and the realtor's relief when I signed the papers should have been my first warning. She was a woman in her 60s, with steady eyes and a careful mouth, the kind of person who'd sold property in those hollers long enough to know which parcels carried stories and which ones didn't. She didn't try to oversell it. She told me straight that the previous owner had walked off the job mid-renovation, that his tools were still inside, that his truck was still parked in the side yard with the keys in the ignition, and that the bank had foreclosed after a year of unpaid notes, with no one able to locate him. She said he must have had some kind of breakdown. She said it the way people say things they want to be true. I signed because the price was right, and because my wife and I had been talking about a summer place for the kids for years, somewhere off the grid, somewhere they could run barefoot and not see a screen for 3 months. The cabin sat at the end of a long gravel drive in McDowell County, tucked into a fold of the mountain, with a creek running behind it and nothing visible from the porch but trees. The bones were good. That's what I kept telling myself. The bones were good. The plan was simple. I had the whole summer off from teaching, and my wife and the kids would join me at the end of July, once school was out for her too. That gave me 11 weeks alone to fix the place up, new drywall in the back rooms, sand the floors, replace the rotten porch boards, get the well tested. The kind of work that's slow and satisfying when you do it alone, with the radio playing and the windows open, and no one needing anything from you. I drove up the first weekend in May with the bed of my truck full of tools and a cooler of sandwiches, and for the first week I was happy in a way I hadn't been in a long time. The cabin had been left in a strange state. The previous owner, whose name was Wendell according to the deed, had clearly been in the middle of something when he'd stopped. There was a coffee cup on the kitchen counter, with mold growing inside it in a perfect green disc. There was a measuring tape on the floor of the back bedroom, still pulled out to 42 inches, like he'd set it down to check something, and never picked it up again. His tool belt hung from a nail by the door. His boots, caked with dried mud, sat under the kitchen table. I gathered all of it into a contractor bag the first afternoon, and the realtor had given me his sister's number in case anyone ever came looking for his things, but no one ever did. The first week, like I said, was fine. I worked sunup to sundown. I slept hard. The cabin made the noises old cabins make, the settling and the creaking and the occasional thump of something landing on the tin roof, and none of it bothered me, because I'd grown up in a house like that, and I knew the language of wood under weather. I called my wife every evening from the one spot on the porch where the signal came in. I told her the kids were going to love it. I meant it the second week. I started hearing the scratching. It came from inside the south wall of the main room, the wall I hadn't started on yet because it didn't need much. It started somewhere between 2 and 4 in the morning, and it always started the same way, a soft testing sound, like something was checking to see if anyone was listening. Then it would settle into a rhythm, a slow, patient scraping, like fingernails dragged in long, careful strokes along the inside of the wood. The first night I heard it, I lay in bed with my eyes open for an hour. Listening, I told myself raccoons. I told myself squirrels. The cabin was 100 years old, and the walls were full of the kind of gaps small animals could find their way into. In the morning, the sound was gone, and the world looked normal, and I went out and bought a box of traps at the hardware store in town. I set the traps in the crawl space under the cabin that afternoon. The crawl space was the part of the house I'd been putting off, because I hate tight, dark places, and I always have. The entrance was a square hatch in the floor of the mudroom, and when I lifted it, the smell that came up was the smell crawl spaces have, damp earth and old insulation, and something faintly sour underneath. I crawled in maybe 10 feet with a flashlight and set the traps along the joists where I could see droppings, and I crawled back out as fast as I could without admitting to myself that I was hurrying. I closed the hatch. I put a rug over it. I told myself I was being childish. That night the scratching came back. The traps in the crawl space did not go off. I checked them in the morning, untouched, the bait still on them, the springs still set. Whatever was scratching inside the wall was not coming and going through the crawl space. Or if it wasn't interested in peanut butter. The third night I sat up in the main room with the lights off and waited. I had a flashlight and a hammer, which seems funny to me now. The hammer, like I thought I was going to nail the noise shut. The scratching started at 2:17. I'd been watching the clock. It came from a spot about 4 feet up the wall, between two studs, and when I put my ear close to the drywall, I could hear it clearer than I wanted to. It wasn't claws. I'd convinced myself for 2 nights that it was claws, but with my ear against the wall, I could tell it was something softer than that, something more deliberate. The strokes were too long and too even. It was the sound of something being drawn slowly down the wood. I stood there with my cheek against the cold wall, for I don't know how long, and at some point the scratching stopped. All at once, the way it would stop, if whatever was making it had heard me breathing. The next morning, I tore out the drywall. I want to be careful here, because I've told this story to a few people over the years, and I've noticed that when I get to this part, their faces do something, and they stop hearing me the way they were hearing me before. So I'm going to tell it plain. I pulled the drywall off the studs in a section about 3 feet square, and behind the drywall, packed tight into the cavity between the studs, was hair. Human hair, pounds of it, woven and matted together in a dense gray mass that filled the entire space from the floor plate up past where I'd cut. It wasn't one person's hair. There were strands of black, and strands of brown, and strands of red, and strands of gray, and strands of white. All different lengths, some of them long enough to have come from a woman's head, some of them short and coarse. They were woven together, not pressed. Someone had braided and twisted and packed that hair into the wall, methodically, in a way that must have taken hours and hours, maybe days. The smell that came out of the cavity when I broke the drywall was not the smell of decay. It was something drier, older, like the smell at the bottom of an old hope chest. But wrong. I stood there with the hammer in my hand, and I couldn't move for a long time. When I made myself move, I reached in with a pair of pliers, and I pulled some of the hair loose, because I had to know if it was real, and it was real. It came out in a thick rope, and when it did, I saw what was behind it. The original wood paneling. The cabin's first walls, the rough sawn pine the place, had been built with a century ago, still nailed up behind the newer drywall, and carved into that pine, in the cavity where the hair had been packed, were tally marks, hundreds of them, maybe 1,000. Groups of 5, the 4 vertical strokes and the slash across, row after row after row, climbing up the inside of the wall as high as I could see by flashlight. The marks were old. Some of them had darkened with age. The ones nearer the bottom were so deep into the wood that they couldn't have been made in one stroke. Someone had gone over them and over them. I called the sheriff from the porch. My hands were shaking, and I had to dial 3 times. The deputy who came out was a man in his 40s named Hatfield, lean and tired-looking, the kind of cop who'd been doing the job long enough that nothing on the surface surprised him anymore. I walked him into the main room, and I showed him the wall. He looked at it for maybe 20 seconds. He didn't go closer. He didn't touch anything. He just stood there looking. and his face did the thing I'd later see on the faces of the people I told the story to. Except his face did it faster and with more certainty, like he was placing the wall into a category he already had a name for. He turned to me, and he asked me, very calmly, how long I'd been sleeping in the cabin. I told him 2 weeks. I told him I'd been alone the whole time. I told him about the scratching, about the nights, about the way it stopped when I'd put my ear to the wall. While I was talking, his eyes moved around the room, not searching exactly, cataloging. He looked at the rug over the crawlspace hatch in the mudroom. He looked at the back door. He looked at the kitchen sink, which I'd been using for 2 weeks, and the fridge, which I'd stocked. He looked at the bed in the back room where I'd been sleeping. And then he looked at me, and he said very quietly that he needed me to pack a bag and follow him into town. Right then, don't take anything I didn't absolutely need. Don't go into the crawl space. Don't go into the basement, which the cabin didn't have, but he said it anyway, the way you say things to make sure. I asked him why. He said he'd tell me at the station. He said it in a voice that didn't leave room for asking again. I packed a bag in 5 minutes. While I was in the back room, throwing clothes into a duffel, I heard him on his radio in the main room, low and fast, calling for backup and asking for the K9 unit, and asking whether the state boys could be there within the hour. I came out with my bag, and he walked me to my truck, and he stood at the door of his cruiser watching the cabin the whole time I started the engine. I followed him down the gravel drive in the rear-view mirror, and as we pulled out onto the county road, 2 more cruisers passed us, going the other way, fast, with their lights on, but their sirens off. He put me up in a motel in Welch. He told me to stay there, and not to go back to the cabin for any reason. He took my phone number, and he told me he'd call me when he had something to tell me. I asked him again what was happening. He told me he didn't know yet, and I believed that he didn't, but I could tell he was afraid of what he might find out. And I knew that fear was about me, about what I'd been doing in that cabin for 2 weeks without knowing. The motel room had a television bolted to the dresser. I didn't sleep. Around 11 that night, the local news came on, and I sat on the edge of the bed in my clothes. And I watched the live shot of my own gravel drive from the road, with the lights of 6 emergency vehicles strobing through the trees. The reporter was a young woman with her hair pulled back, and she was reading from notes. And she said that authorities had located a missing person from Welch named Wendell Mullins, who had been reported missing 11 months ago, after abandoning a renovation job at the property behind her. She said he had been found alive. She said he had been found on the property. She said that, according to a source within the sheriff's department, Mr. Mullins had been living in the crawl space beneath the cabin for an estimated 3 months, and that the current resident of the cabin had been unaware of his presence. I don't remember the rest of the broadcast. I remember the bedspread under my hands. I remember the sound of my own breathing in the room. The sheriff came to the motel in the morning. He sat in the chair by the window, and he told me what they'd found under the floorboards. He told me about the nest of insulation Wendell had pulled down and packed into a kind of bed. He told me about the plastic jug of water and the coffee can he'd been using for waste. He told me about the small hole drilled up through the floor of the main room into the south wall cavity. The hole I'd never noticed because the rug had covered it. The hole Wendell had been using to listen. He told me Wendell hadn't spoken a word since they'd pulled him out. He told me Wendell had a knife on him, a small carving knife, the kind a man might use to make tally marks in old pine, and that the blade was sharp, and that there was hair caught in the joint where the blade met the handle, hair of several different colors, some of it gray. He told me they didn't know yet where the hair had come from. He told me they were looking. He asked me if I'd ever woken in the night, feeling like someone was in the room with me. I told him no. He nodded, and he didn't say anything for a long moment. And then he told me I was a lucky man. I sold the cabin. I never went back inside. The realtor handled everything, and the new buyer got it for even less than I'd paid. And I don't know what he was told, and I don't want to know. My wife and the kids never saw the place. I told her some of it, the parts I could say out loud, and she held my hand for a long time, and she didn't ask the rest. We bought a place in Tennessee the next year, a normal house on a normal street, and the kids grew up there, and they're grown now, and I have not slept a full night in 9 years. I lie awake sometimes, and I think about those tally marks climbing up the inside of that wall, and I think about how many of them were already there when I closed on the cabin. And I think about whose hair was woven into that gray blanket. And I wonder, the way I've wondered every night since, what exactly Wendell had been counting. We bought the cabin at auction in the fall of 2018, and I should have known something was wrong by how cheap it went. It was a 4-generation homestead on 28 acres in Webster County, with the original hand-hewn beams still in the ceiling and a stone fireplace big enough to roast a hog in. And we got it for less than what a used car costs. The auctioneer was a heavy-set man with a kind face and a way of looking past you when he talked, and he told us the story in the parking lot afterward, while my wife signed the last of the papers on the hood of his truck. The Callaways had lived there since 1898. 4 generations under one roof, fathers and sons and daughters, 120 years of births and weddings and wakes in the same handful of rooms. The last of them, an old woman named Verna, had died the year before, and the estate had gone unclaimed because there wasn't anyone left to claim it. No surviving children, no nieces or nephews who'd return the certified letters. The line had just ended, the way lines sometimes do in those hollers, quietly and without any fuss. My wife Rachel loved the cabin from the moment she walked onto the porch. She has the kind of soul that finds beauty in old things, and the cabin was the most old thing either of us had ever owned. The floorboards were pine planks 20 inches wide, dark with a century of footfall. The windows had wavy glass, the original panes, and the light came through them, the way light comes through water. There was a rope of dried sage hanging from a nail by the back door that Rachel said we shouldn't take down, even though we didn't know who'd hung it or how long ago. She walked from room to room with her hand trailing along the walls, and she kept saying she could feel the family in it, and she meant it as a good thing. I tried to feel what she felt. I want to be clear about that, because the way this story turns has made me think back on those first few days a lot, and I don't want to pretend I knew. I didn't know. I just had the smaller, quieter feeling that men get sometimes in old houses, the sense of being looked at by rooms, not unkindly, just looked at. I told myself it was the weight of all those years and all those lives, settled into the wood. I told myself I'd get used to it. The trouble started with the photographs. We found them in a hall closet on the 3rd day, when Rachel was clearing out the linen shelves to put our own sheets in. There were 3 boxes of them, cardboard banker's boxes, warped with age, packed full of photographs in no particular order, loose snapshots and framed portraits and tintypes in little velvet cases. Hundreds of them, maybe 1,000. The Callaways had not thrown a photograph away in 4 generations, and they had not organized them either. So when we sat down on the living room rug to look through them, it was like sifting through time without a map, a color Polaroid from the 70s, sitting on top of a sepia print of a woman in a high collar from before the First World War. A baby in a christening gown from God. Knows one next to a teenager in a Letterman jacket from the 80s. Rachel was delighted. She kept holding photos up to the light and saying, "Look at her dress. Look at this little boy's face. Look at how the porch hasn't changed." She was right about the porch. The porch hadn't changed. Neither had the fireplace, or the front door, or the view out the kitchen window across the south pasture. Photograph after photograph showed the same rooms we were sitting in, with the same furniture in slightly different arrangements, and the same family aging through the decades, like a slow time lapse. The same nose, the same chin, the same wide-set eyes, passed down from a great-grandmother to a granddaughter, to a great-great-granddaughter. 4 generations of Callaways, standing in front of the same fireplace at the same Christmases and Easters and birthdays. It took me an hour to notice the man. I was looking at a photograph from 1948, a posed family portrait in front of the porch, maybe a dozen people in their Sunday clothes, squinting into the sun. Mother, father, 6 children of varying ages, 2 old people who must have been grandparents, a couple of uncles. And behind them, standing a little back, not quite part of the group, but not separate from it either, a tall man in a long dark coat and a wide-brimmed hat. His face was turned toward the camera, but it wasn't quite in focus, not blurred from movement, just soft, the way faces go soft when a camera can't decide where to settle. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't doing anything. He was just standing there, at the back of the family, like he belonged. I set that photograph aside and picked up another one. A different year. The clothes were different, and the children were different, and the grandparents were different, but the porch was the same, and the fireplace was the same. And standing behind the family, in the long coat and the wide-brimmed hat, was the man. Same posture, same out-of-focus face, same blank, watchful stillness. I started going through the boxes faster. Rachel asked me what I was doing. I didn't answer her for a while. I was pulling photographs out and laying them on the floor in a rough chronology, going by the clothes and the hairstyles and the quality of the prints. A wedding portrait from 1912, a stiff young couple on the porch, with their families gathered around them. The man was there, behind the bride's grandmother, slightly to the left, in the coat and the hat. A photograph of a barn, raising from what must have been the 1920s. The men in suspenders and shirt sleeves, the women holding up baskets of food. He was at the edge of the frame, watching. A color photograph from the early 60s, a Christmas morning, a little girl in pajamas holding up a doll. He was standing in the kitchen doorway behind her. A 2003 photograph, recent enough that the photo paper was still glossy, an old woman in a wheelchair on the porch with her hand on the rail, smiling at someone off camera. He was behind her chair, same coat, same hat, same face. I laid them all out on the kitchen table. I made Rachel come look. I put them in order, left to right, oldest to newest, and I pointed. She didn't say anything for a long time. She picked up one of the older photographs and held it close to her eyes, and then she picked up one of the newer ones and held it next to the first one, and she looked back and forth between them. The light in the kitchen was the soft gold of late afternoon, and I could hear the creek running behind the house. She set the photographs down very carefully, the way you set something down when your hands aren't entirely steady. She said it had to be different men. She said it had to be a family resemblance, an uncle or a cousin who'd looked like his father, who'd looked like his grandfather. The way families breed true in those hollers where nobody marries far. She said the hat and the coat were a coincidence, that men in that part of the country had worn the same kind of clothes for 100 years, that I was seeing a pattern that wasn't there. I didn't argue with her. I just laid out two photographs side by side. One was a tintype from what must have been around 1905, the oldest photograph in the boxes. The other was the 2003 photograph of the old woman in the wheelchair. Almost 100 years between them. I pointed at the man in each one. The face wasn't quite in focus in either photograph, the way it wasn't quite in focus in any of them. But you could see the shape of the jaw and the set of the eyes and the line of the mouth. They were the same, not similar, the same. Rachel went quiet. She picked up the 2003 photograph and she looked at it for a long time, and then she set it down and she walked out of the kitchen. And I heard her in the bedroom opening drawers. She came back 5 minutes later with her overnight bag packed. She said she wanted to leave that night. She said we could come back in the morning when it was light, with the auctioneer or with somebody, but she didn't want to sleep there. I told her it was a 4-hour drive back to our house, and it was already past 8. And the roads through the mountains weren't safe in the dark. I told her we'd lock all the doors, and we'd leave the lights on, and we'd drive out at first light. I told her there was a logical explanation, and we just hadn't found it yet. I said, all the things husbands say when their wives are scared, and they don't want to admit they're scared too. She agreed to stay. I've thought about that a lot in the years since, the way she agreed. The way she looked at me when she agreed. We didn't put the photographs away. They were still spread out on the kitchen table when we went to bed. I locked the front door and the back door, and I checked the windows in every room. And I left the lamp on in the living room and the light on over the kitchen sink. We lay in bed in the master bedroom, which had been the Callaways' master bedroom for 4 generations. And we didn't talk. I could hear Rachel breathing too fast for a long time, and then her breathing slowed, and I thought she'd fallen asleep, and after a while I did too. I woke at 3 in the morning, or near enough that it doesn't matter. I woke because I heard the floorboards. The hallway outside our bedroom had the same wide pine planks as the rest of the cabin, and they creaked under any weight. The floorboards I was hearing were not the random settling creaks an old house makes at night. They were footsteps, slow, deliberate footsteps, coming down the hallway from the direction of the kitchen. They were the footsteps of a man walking carefully, not trying to be silent, but not in any hurry either. They were the footsteps of someone who knew the hallway, who knew which boards were loud and which ones weren't, and didn't care. I sat up. The room was dark except for the faint orange wash from the lamp in the living room, which threw a long rectangle of light across the bedroom floor through the open doorway. Rachel was already awake. She was sitting up too, her back against the headboard, and she was staring at the doorway, with her mouth slightly open, and her eyes very wide, and she wasn't moving. She wasn't reaching for me. She wasn't doing anything. She was just looking. I followed her eyes. Standing in the bedroom doorway was the man. He was tall enough that the brim of his hat almost touched the top of the doorframe. He was wearing a long dark coat that came down past his knees, and the coat looked old, the way clothes in the photographs from 100 years ago looked old, but not worn out. Cared for, his hands were at his sides. I couldn't see them clearly because of the dark, but I could see the shape of them, long and still. His face under the hat was in shadow, except for the dim orange light catching on the line of his jaw and the bridge of his nose, and his face was not in focus. I don't know how else to say it. I was looking right at him from 10 feet away, and his face would not resolve. It was like looking at a face through frosted glass, except there was no glass. He didn't move. He didn't speak. He didn't seem to be breathing, although I couldn't have heard him breathe over the sound of my own heart in my ears. He was just standing there, in our doorway, watching us in the dark. I have read about how people freeze when they are afraid, and I have always thought I would be the kind of man who fought, who moved, who at least yelled. I was not that kind of man that night. I sat in that bed next to my wife, and I did not move, and I did not make a sound, and neither did she. I want to tell you that we held each other, but we didn't. We didn't touch. We just sat there, side by side, and we watched the man in the doorway, and the man in the doorway watched us back. The longest I have ever been awake in my life was those hours. I do not know what time he came. I do not know what time he left. I know that at some point I realized the rectangle of lamplight on the floor had changed color, gone from orange to gray, and that the window behind us had begun to fill with the dim blue of the hour before dawn, and that when I looked back at the doorway, the man was still there. He had not moved. He had not shifted his weight, or turned his head, or done anything at all. He was standing in the same place, in the same posture, like a photograph of a man, like the photographs on our kitchen table. The sun came up. The light in the bedroom went from gray to gold, and at some point in that gold light, between one blink and the next, the doorway was empty. I don't remember leaving. I remember Rachel's hand finally finding mine after the doorway was empty, and I remember her hand was cold. I remember we did not speak as we got dressed. I remember we left the photographs on the kitchen table, and we left our coffee mugs in the sink, and we left the rope of dried sage hanging by the back door, and we drove down the mountain in the truck with the heater on full because neither of us could get warm. We never went back. The cabin sat empty for 2 more years before another family bought it, and I don't know if they're still living there or not. I have looked, sometimes in the way you can't help looking. The county records show the property has changed hands twice since us. I don't know what that means. I tell myself it could mean anything. Rachel and I don't talk about that night. We tried once, a few months after, and she said something I have not been able to forget, which was that she thought he hadn't been watching us. She thought he had been waiting. She didn't say waiting for what, and I didn't ask, and we have not spoken about it since. But I think about it. I think about it most when I look at our family photographs, the ones we take now, at birthdays and holidays and on vacations. I look at the backgrounds of them. I look at the doorways behind us. I have not seen him yet, but I look. I booked the cabin in February of 2022 for a solo writing retreat I'd been promising myself for 3 years. 6 nights, deep in the woods, on the Tennessee side of the line, maybe 2 miles from where the state border crosses the ridge into North Carolina. I'd been working on the same novel for longer than I want to admit, and I'd convinced myself that what I needed was silence and trees, and no internet. And the listing for this cabin had all 3. The pictures showed a small 1-room place with a sleeping loft, a wood stove, a writing desk under a window that looked out at nothing but laurel and rhododendron. The reviews were the kind that read, like the people who wrote them, had been changed by the trip. Quiet, restorative, off the grid. I booked it without thinking too hard about how far off the grid actually was. The host's name was Dale. He answered my booking confirmation within an hour, and his welcome email was the kind of thorough that put me at ease. Instructions for the well pump. Instructions for the wood stove. Phone number for the propane company, in case the tank ran low, though he said it shouldn't. He told me where the nearest grocery store was, which was 45 minutes back down the mountain, and where the nearest hospital was, which was over an hour. He told me there was no cell signal at the cabin, but there was a landline that worked most of the time. At the bottom of the email, almost as an afterthought, he wrote a single line about the front door. He said it's stuck sometimes, and that I should always use the deadbolt instead of the knob lock when I went to bed, because the knob lock didn't always catch on its own. He didn't elaborate. He signed off and said to enjoy the cabin. I drove up on a Sunday afternoon in late February, and the drive itself should have told me something about what I'd signed up for. The last 7 miles were on a gravel road that climbed steadily into the trees, and there were maybe 4 other driveways along the way, all of them with mailboxes that hadn't been opened in a long time. The cabin was at the end of the road, in a small clearing with the ridge rising up on 3 sides. There was no other house in sight. The key was in a lockbox on the porch rail, and the combination Dale had emailed me opened it on the first try, and I let myself in and stood in the doorway, looking at the place I was going to be alone in for 6 nights. It was beautiful. I want to say that because I think it matters. The light through the south-facing window came in honey-colored across the floorboards, and the wood stove was already laid with kindling, and there was a handwritten note on the kitchen table from Dale's wife, welcoming me and pointing out where the extra blankets were. The writing desk under the window was exactly as it had looked in the photographs. I unpacked my laptop and my notebooks and a thermos of coffee I'd bought in town, and I sat down at that desk and I wrote 2,000 words before sundown. It was the most I'd written in a single sitting in 2 years. I went to bed that first night feeling like I'd made the right decision. I locked the front door before I climbed up to the sleeping loft. I remember doing it because Dale's warning had been the last thing I'd read on my phone before driving up the mountain, and I'd made a small mental note to use the deadbolt every night. I turned the deadbolt. I heard it slide home. I went up to the loft, and I read for a while, and I fell asleep around 11. I woke at midnight to use the bathroom. The bathroom was downstairs, off the kitchen, and I came down the loft ladder in my socks and walked across the main room in the dark. And the moonlight through the windows was bright enough that I didn't bother turning on a lamp. I went past the front door without looking at it. On my way back from the bathroom, I did look at it. The front door was standing wide open. It was open all the way, pulled flat against the inside wall, and the cold air from outside was coming into the cabin in a slow, steady draft. I stood in the middle of the room, and I looked at that door for a long time. I checked the deadbolt. The deadbolt was turned to the unlocked position. The knob lock was also unlocked. Outside the doorway, the porch was empty, and beyond the porch, the clearing was empty, and beyond the clearing was just the dark wall of trees. There was no wind. The night was completely still. I told myself the door had not been properly latched. I told myself the deadbolt must have been one of those finicky old mechanisms that didn't seat correctly if you didn't turn it hard enough. I told myself Dale's warning had been about exactly this, and that I'd been careless. I closed the door. I turned the deadbolt firmly, and I felt it slide home, and I tested it by pulling on the knob to make sure the door wouldn't open. It wouldn't. I went around the cabin and I checked every window, all 4 of them, and they were all latched. Then I went back up to the loft and I lay in bed for a long time before I fell asleep again. The second night, I was more careful. I locked the deadbolt before dinner and tested it twice. I checked the windows before I went up to the loft. I left a small lamp on in the main room, the kind of low, warm light that I'd be able to see from the loft if I opened my eyes. I went to sleep around 11 again. I woke at 1:30 in the morning. I don't know what woke me. I lay in the loft for a minute listening, and I didn't hear anything, but I had the feeling you get when something has changed in a room while you weren't looking at it. I climbed down the ladder. The front door was standing wide open. Again, all the way to the wall. The lamp in the main room was still on, and in its yellow light I could see the deadbolt was turned, and the knob was turned, and the cold from the open doorway was filling the room. I stood at the bottom of the ladder in my socks, and I looked at that doorway, and I called out, in a voice that I tried to make sound steady, asking if there was anyone there. No one answered. The porch was empty. The clearing was empty. The night was as still as it had been the night before. I closed the door. I locked it again. I went back to the loft. I did not sleep well. By the third night, I had a method. I closed the cabin up an hour before sundown, deadbolt and windows, and the back door, which I'd discovered was bolted shut from the inside, with a separate slide bolt that hadn't been touched in years. I checked the deadbolt every hour from sundown to midnight. I sat at the writing desk and worked, and every 60 minutes I'd get up, walk to the front door, try the knob, look at the deadbolt, and walk back. The door stayed shut. The deadbolt stayed turned. At 11:30, I went up to the loft. The third night, the door opened sometime between 2 and 4 in the morning. I know because I was awake at 2, having gotten up to use the bathroom and checked the door on the way back. And I was awake again at 4, because I heard something downstairs, a soft sound I couldn't place. And when I came down the ladder, the door was open. The lamp was still on. The cabin was empty. The clearing was empty. I closed the door, and I sat on the couch in the main room for the rest of the night, with a flashlight in my lap, watching it. The door did not open again that night, but I did not sleep. I should have left. I want to say that, because I've thought about it 1,000 times since. I should have packed my car at first light on the 4th morning and driven down that mountain, and I would not have anything else to tell you. But I didn't leave. I told myself I had 3 more nights paid for, and I was being foolish, that there was a logical explanation, that mountain cabins did strange things in the cold and the wind and the settling. I told myself I was a grown man, and I was not going to be chased out of a place I'd paid good money for by a door. I drove down to the town, at the bottom of the mountain that morning, and I bought a roll of duct tape and a set of those small wedge doorstops that slide under doors to hold them shut, and I drove back up. On the 4th night, I wedged 2 of the doorstops under the front door. From the inside, jammed them in hard with the heel of my boot. I turned the deadbolt and the knob lock. I ran a strip of duct tape across the seam of the door and the frame, the way you'd tape a refrigerator shut. I set up my phone on the kitchen table on a stack of books, propped, so the camera was pointed at the front door, and I started recording video. I had a portable battery pack so the phone could run all night. I went up to the loft. I woke at 6 in the morning to gray light coming through the loft window. I climbed down the ladder. The duct tape was hanging in 2 pieces, torn cleanly. The doorstops were sitting neatly on the floor, a few feet inside the room, side by side like someone had set them down. The deadbolt was unlocked. The knob lock was unlocked. The door was standing wide open. My phone was still recording on the kitchen table. I took the phone outside to the porch in the morning light, and I sat on the steps, and I watched the footage. For the first 4 hours, the door stayed shut. The duct tape held. The wedges held. I could see the corner of myself going up the ladder at 11:30. The cabin was quiet. The lamp in the main room was on, and the light didn't change. At 2:47 in the morning, by the timestamp in the corner of the screen, the deadbolt turned. I watched it. I rewound it 3 times. The little brass lever of the deadbolt rotated counterclockwise, smoothly, and without hesitation, the way it would rotate if a hand were turning it. There was no hand visible. The knob turned next, also counterclockwise, the same smooth motion. Then the door began to move inward. It moved slowly, in the way a door moves when someone is opening it gently because they don't want it to creak. It opened maybe 6 inches, and the duct tape stretched, and then the tape tore, both pieces at once, with a small, audible snap that I could hear through the phone's microphone. The door continued opening. It pushed the 2 wedges across the floor for a few inches, and then, a moment later, the wedges lifted slightly, as if someone had bent down and picked them up, and they moved through the air and were set down side by side, a few feet inside the room. The door swung the rest of the way open, all the way to the wall. I rewound it again. I watched the doorway after the door was open. Nothing came in. Nothing was visible outside the door. No figure on the porch, no shape in the clearing. The night beyond the threshold was just the night, but the phone's microphone was sensitive, and when I turned the volume on my phone all the way up and held it to my ear, I could hear something I hadn't heard the first time through. Breathing. Slow, steady, deliberate breathing. The breathing of someone standing just past the threshold, in the doorway, close enough to the phone that the microphone caught it. It went on for maybe 40 minutes. I fast-forwarded. The door stayed open until just before 6 in the morning, when the loft window started to lighten, and then the door stayed open. But the breathing stopped. It just stopped. There was no sound of footsteps. There was no sound of anyone leaving. I packed my car at sunrise. I did not eat breakfast. I rolled my clothes into my duffel bag in a kind of controlled hurry, and I carried my bags out one at a time, and I made 3 trips, because I am the kind of person who does not leave things behind even when I should. On my last trip out, I was standing on the porch with my laptop bag over my shoulder, and I turned to pull the door shut behind me, and I looked at the deadbolt. There was no keyhole on the outside of the door. The deadbolt was the old kind, the kind with a thumbnail on the inside and a smooth brass plate on the outside. No slot, no keyway. The knob had a keyhole, the regular kind for a knob lock, but the deadbolt could only be operated from inside the cabin. I stood there on the porch with my laptop bag over my shoulder, and I looked at that smooth brass plate, and I understood something that I had not let myself understand for 4 nights. Whatever had been turning that deadbolt had not been coming in from outside. It had been in there with me. It had been in there the whole time. Every night when I locked the door, I had not been keeping something out. I had been locking myself in with it. And every night, sometime in the small hours, it had walked from wherever it spent the rest of the time, and it had turned the deadbolt counterclockwise, and it had opened the door, and it had stood in the doorway and breathed in the cold night air for a while. And then, before morning, it had gone back to wherever it had been. I drove down the mountain with my hands tight on the wheel. I did not look at the cabin in the rearview mirror. I emailed Dale that night from a hotel in Knoxville. I told him I'd had to leave early because of family emergency. I did not mention the door. He emailed me back the next day, polite and brief, and at the bottom of his email, he wrote that he hoped everything was all right with my family, and that he hoped I'd come back sometime. I have not replied. The listing is still active. I check it sometimes. The reviews are still the same kind of reviews, quiet and restorative and off the grid, and I read them, and I wonder which of those people heard breathing and which of them did not. I have thought a great deal in the years since about what was in the cabin with me. I have thought about whether it had been there before I arrived, or whether I brought it with me. I have thought about whether it watched me write at the desk, or watched me sleep in the loft, or watched me eat my dinner at the kitchen table, and whether it minded my being there or whether it was glad of the company. I do not know. I do not want to know. But I will tell you the thing I think about most. The thing I cannot stop thinking about, which is that for 4 nights, it opened the door and stood in the doorway and breathed. And then it closed the door back up and went somewhere else in the cabin. And it never, not once, came up to the loft. I have wondered sometimes what it was waiting for. My grandfather Earl bought the cabin on the Cumberland Plateau in the spring of 1962, the year my mother was born, and he kept it for 55 years, until he died in his sleep at the age of 89. It was the only piece of property he owned outright, and in his will it came to me, because I was the only grandchild who had ever asked him about it. The others had been there a few times as kids, and remembered it the way kids remember places, in fragments and feelings, but I'd been the one who'd ridden up with him every summer, from the time I was 7 until I went to college, and I'd been the one who'd sat on the porch with him in the evenings while he smoked his pipe and didn't talk much. I'd loved him, and I'd loved the cabin, and when the lawyer handed me the deed in the spring of 2017, I cried in a way I had not let myself cry at the funeral. The cabin was up on a ridge above a small unnamed creek in a part of Tennessee where the plateau folds itself into a series of long flat-topped hills with steep wooded sides. The nearest town was 22 miles away. The nearest neighbor was 3 miles down the gravel road. The cabin itself was a simple one-room place with a sleeping porch tacked onto the back and an outhouse 20 feet from the kitchen door. My grandfather had built most of it himself in the 60s, with help from his brother Royce. And the workmanship was the kind of careful old-fashioned work you don't see anymore. The doors hung true, the windows latched or square. The floor was level, 55 years on, in a way that would shame a lot of newer buildings. The guest book sat on a small table by the front door. It had been there for as long as I could remember. It was a leather-bound ledger, the kind a hardware store would have sold in the 60s, with lined pages and a cloth ribbon for marking your place. My grandfather had a rule that every visitor had to sign it. He'd been militant about it. I remembered him standing over my friends in high school, when I'd brought a few buddies up for a weekend, pointing at the open book on the table, telling them they couldn't go past the threshold until they'd written their name and the date. He'd done it kindly. He'd done it like it was a charming family tradition. But he'd done it every time with every visitor for 55 years. I drove up to the cabin on a Friday in October of 2017, 6 months after he passed. I'd come up alone because I wanted to spend some time with the place before I figured out what to do with it. I planned to stay through Monday, 3 nights. The drive was long and the road was bad, and I got there as the afternoon light was starting to fade, and I let myself in with my grandfather's key. The cabin smelled the way it had always smelled, of wood smoke and cedar, and the faint mineral tang of the well water. I dropped my bag inside the door. I walked to the table where the guest book sat. I signed my name and the date, the way I'd been raised to do, the way I'd done every time I'd come up since I was 7 years old. I wrote, Andrew Whitlock, arrived Oct. 13, 2017, planned to stay through Monday. I closed the book. I went to unpack. It rained that first night. The kind of slow-soaking October rain that the plateau gets when the weather turns, and it kept on all day Saturday, and I decided I'd spend the day inside. I built up the fire in the wood stove, and I made coffee, and I sat at the kitchen table with the guest book in front of me, because I'd never read it. 55 years of visitors. My grandfather's whole social life, basically, written down in one place. I thought I'd read every entry. I thought it would be a way of being with him. The first entries were in his own handwriting, dated 1962 and 1963. Brief notations about the construction of the cabin and the first hunting trips he'd taken there with Royce. Then the entries began to fill in with other names, friends from town, men he'd worked with at the rail yard, his brothers-in-law. Most of the entries were short. Hunting trip, 3 days, 2 deer. Fishing weekend, caught a stringer of bluegill. Family reunion, 14 of us in the yard. Maureen brought the potato salad. Normal entries. The kind of thing a guest book is for. I was maybe 20 pages in, somewhere in 1968, when I came across the first entry that stopped me. It was a man named Harold Tucker, and his entry began the way most of them did. Up for the weekend with Earl, weather is fine, supposed to fish tomorrow if the. That was where it ended. Mid-sentence. The handwriting just stopped, in the middle of the word the, with no period and no signature beneath it. The next entry, several days later, was in my grandfather's hand. It said, "Cleaned the cabin." That was all. I turned the page. I read on. Another entry, this one from 1971. A woman named Linda Bell, the wife of one of my grandfather's co-workers. Earl was kind enough to let us stay the weekend. The boys are loving the creek, and Bill says he hasn't slept this well in. Then nothing. The handwriting trailed off in the middle of "in." The next page was blank, and the page after that was an entry from my grandfather, a week later, 3 words. Cleaned the cabin. I went through the book slowly after that. I went through it page by page. I was looking for the entries that stopped, and I started counting them. They were not common, but they were there. Every few years, sometimes 2 or 3 in a year, and then none for a long time, an entry would simply end. Sometimes it was mid-sentence, sometimes it was mid-word. The handwriting did not become shaky or rushed before it stopped. It did not look like the person had been interrupted by anything obvious. The pen just lifted from the paper and did not come back down. The entry that followed, always, was in my grandfather's hand, and was always some variation of the same brief notation. Cleaned the cabin, closed the cabin up for the season, put things to rights. I counted 43 of them across 55 years. By the time I'd finished going through the book, it was Saturday evening. The rain had let up. The light outside was the pewter gray that comes before sundown in the fall. And the cabin was quiet in the way it gets, when the wind isn't moving in the trees. I sat at the kitchen table, with the book closed in front of me. And I thought about my grandfather, and I thought about every visitor he'd ever had me sign that book in front of, and I thought about how he had not, in 55 years of bringing me up to that cabin, ever once let me stay longer than 2 nights. I'd never noticed. We'd come up Friday afternoons, and we'd leave Sunday afternoons, every time, like clockwork. As a kid, I'd thought it was because of his work schedule. As a teenager, I'd thought it was because he didn't want my grandmother to be alone for too long. I'd never asked. He'd never explained. We had simply, always, left on Sunday. I called my great-uncle Royce that evening. He was 86 years old and lived in a house in Cookville with one of his daughters. And he answered the phone himself on the 3rd ring. I told him who I was. We talked for a minute about my grandfather, about the funeral, about how the family was holding up. Then I told him I was at the cabin. I told him I'd been reading the guest book. I told him about the entries that ended mid-sentence, and I told him I'd counted 43 of them. He was quiet for a long time. I could hear the television in the background of his house, some game show, faint and tinny. When he spoke, his voice had gotten smaller. He asked me how long I'd been at the cabin. I told him I'd arrived Friday afternoon. He asked me if I'd signed the book. I told him I had on arrival the way Granddad had always made everyone do. He was quiet again. Then he asked me what day I was planning to leave. I told him Monday. 3 nights. He told me to leave in the morning. He said it plainly, without any of the bluster old men sometimes use on younger ones. And the plainness of it was what made me listen. He told me that when my grandfather had bought that piece of land in 1962, the people who lived along that road had warned him. They'd told him there was something on that ridge, something that didn't bother people who came and went, but didn't like people who stayed. He told me, my grandfather had laughed it off at first, the way young men do, but that something had happened. In the first few years, something Royce wouldn't tell me about over the phone, and my grandfather had come to believe the warnings. And from that point on, he'd made his own rules about the cabin, and he'd kept to them, and he'd made everyone who came up keep to them too. And that was why he was still alive at 89, when so many of the men he'd known weren't. The rules, Royce said, were these. You didn't stay more than 2 nights. You didn't go out after dark. You didn't leave the cabin between sundown and sunup for any reason, not for the outhouse, not for anything. And you never signed the book unless you were leaving. Earl had been very particular about that one. He'd made everyone sign on departure, not arrival, with the date they were leaving, and not the date they'd come. He'd made it look like a charming custom. He'd made it look like the kind of thing a folksy old man would insist on for his cabin's history. I told Royce that my grandfather had always made me sign on arrival. Royce was quiet for a long time. Then he said that my grandfather had been protecting me. He said that signing on arrival was the thing you didn't do. Signing on arrival was how it knew you were there. The 43 entries in that book that stopped mid-sentence, Royce said, were people who had signed when they shouldn't have. People who had stayed too long. People who had broken the rules. I asked him what it was. I asked him what was in the woods. He told me my grandfather had never said, that my grandfather had never claimed to know. He told me there were old stories from before the cabin was built, from the families who had lived on the plateau before. But he didn't believe in repeating them, because repeating them gave them weight. He said only that whatever it was, it walked at night, and it was patient, and it could wait for years between visits. He said it didn't always come. He said sometimes a man could stay 3 nights and come home fine. But you didn't bet on it. You didn't push. You followed Earl's rules, and you went home on Sunday, and you didn't sign the book until your hand was on the doorknob. I told him I'd leave in the morning. He told me to do that. He told me to lock the doors, and to stay inside, and to not look out the windows after dark. He told me to keep the lights off. He told me he loved me, and that he was sorry he hadn't said something sooner. He hung up. I sat at the kitchen table for a long time after that, with the phone in my hand. The light outside the windows had gone from pewter to a deep blue. The rain had stopped completely. The wind was not moving. The cabin was very quiet, and I could hear my own breathing, and I could hear the small sounds of the wood stove in the next room, the soft tick of the iron as it cooled. I got up. I locked the front door. I locked the back door, which led out to the sleeping porch. I went through the cabin, and I closed every curtain on every window. And there were 6 windows, and the curtains were old and heavy, and they cut the light down to nothing. I turned off the lamps. I turned off the kitchen light. I took my grandfather's rifle down from the rack above the fireplace, a .30-30 he'd had for 40 years, and I loaded it with shells from the box in the kitchen drawer. I went into the bathroom, which was the smallest room in the cabin, and the only one with no exterior windows. And I sat down on the floor between the toilet and the bathtub, and I held the rifle across my knees, and I waited. The scratching started a little after 11. It came from the porch. It was the sound of fingernails being drawn slowly across the wood of the porch boards, in long, even strokes, from one end to the other, not the sound an animal would make. An animal would scratch in short, busy bursts, trying to get at something. This was different. This was someone dragging their hand across the wood deliberately, the way you might drag your hand across a railing as you walked. It went from the left end of the porch to the right, and then it stopped. And a moment later, it started again from the left, the same slow drag, the same patient stroke. It did that for a long time. I don't know how long. I sat on the bathroom floor with the rifle across my knees, and I listened to it, and at some point I realized I was crying, silently, with tears running down my face that I had not been aware of starting. The scratching moved. It went from the porch to the front door, then to the wall beside the door, then to the window beside the wall, and along the glass, and I could hear it on the glass, a high, small sound, and I closed my eyes because I did not want to know if the curtain was moving. It went around the cabin slowly, the front, the side, the back, the other side, the front again. It made the circuit 4 times. Then it stopped at the front door, and it stayed there, and I could hear breathing through the door, slow and patient, the way Royce had said. The breathing did not go away. It stayed at the door until just before sunrise. I know it was just before sunrise because the high bathroom vent above the toilet, the only opening in that room to the outside, began to lighten with the gray of morning, and at some point in that lightening, between 1 second and the next, the breathing was gone. I waited another hour. Then I came out of the bathroom. The cabin was empty. The doors were locked. The curtains were closed. Everything was the way I had left it the night before, except that on the small table by the front door, the guest book had been opened to the page where I had signed my name on Friday, and someone, in a handwriting I did not recognize, had drawn a single thin line under my entry. I packed my car. I did not stop to eat. I left the rifle on the kitchen table because I did not want to touch it any more than I already had. I locked the cabin, and I got in my car, and I drove down the gravel road, and I did not look back. I never finished my entry in the guest book. I never wrote the date I left, or any final word about the trip, or anything at all. The last thing in the book in my handwriting is, "Plan to stay through Monday," and there is a thin line drawn beneath it in a hand that is not mine. I have not been back to the cabin. I cannot bring myself to sell it, because I cannot bring myself to send another family up that road to a place I know I would not warn them about properly. And I cannot bring myself to burn it down, because it is the last thing my grandfather built with his own hands. So it sits up there on the ridge, empty, and I pay the property taxes every year. And I think about it some nights when I cannot sleep. I think about the line under my name. I think about how the entries in that book had all stopped mid-sentence, and how mine had stopped mid-sentence too, and how I had not, in fact, finished it. I think ice about whether that means I got away, or whether it means something else. I think about my grandfather, and the 43 people he had cleaned the cabin after, and what it had cost him to keep me on the porch at sundown all those years, and to make me sign on arrival instead of on leaving. And I think I understand now that he had been protecting me with the only rule he had ever broken for me. He had taken the line under my name onto himself every summer for 11 years, and he had carried it quietly until he died. Our family had owned the cabin on Pine Ridge for 30 years before my brother Cole and I found the other one. My grandfather Wesley bought the property in 1989, 86 acres, along a feeder creek that ran down into the Greenbrier, and we'd grown up on that land. Summers, weekends, Thanksgivings, the whole patchwork of family time that gets stitched into a place when a family is lucky enough to keep it long enough. Cole and I had been all over that property. We'd built forts in the hollows. We'd fished the creek end to end. We'd hunted the ridgelines with our grandfather, and then with our father. And after our father passed in 2014, we'd hunted them alone together, the way brothers do when there's not much family left to do things with. We knew the land. I want to make that clear before I tell the rest of it. We knew that land the way you know the rooms of a house you grew up in. The summer we found it was the summer of 2019. Granddad was 84, and his knees had finally given up on him, and he'd asked us if we'd take on the brush clearing he could no longer do himself. The kudzu had been getting bad along the lower creek, the way kudzu does in those hollows, and there were sections of fence lines that had disappeared into the green entirely. We told him we'd handle it. We took a week off in late July, and we drove up with chainsaws and brush blades and a handcart, and we set up at the main cabin, and we started working our way down the creek, cutting and clearing, and dragging the cut brush into burn piles for the fall. We were 3 days in when we found the roofline. We'd been working a stretch of the creek that ran through a fold in the land neither of us had spent much time in. It was on the far side of the property, near the western boundary, in a low pocket where two ridges came together and the ground sank into a kind of shallow bowl. The kudzu down there was waist deep, and in places head deep, and we'd been cutting through it for an hour without talking much, because the work was hard, and the heat was the kind of heat that closes around your head and makes you stupid. Cole was ahead of me with the chainsaw, and he stopped, and he stood there with the saw idling, and he was looking at something I couldn't see through the brush. When I came up beside him, I saw it too. About 60 yards down the slope, half swallowed by a thick mat of kudzu, was the green tin pitch of a roof. The kudzu had grown over most of it, but the angle of the line was unmistakable. It was a cabin roof. The peak of a gable end stuck up out of the vines, with a stone chimney visible behind it, and the chimney was the old kind, hand-stacked fieldstone, the kind nobody had built in 80 years. Cole shut off the saw. We stood there in the green heat and we looked at it. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment, because I've thought about it a lot since. It was not curiosity, not at first. It was a small, cold feeling in the back of my neck that I did not have a word for. We had walked through that section of woods, not often, but we had walked through it, both of us, on hunts and on hikes, over 30 years. I had hunted within 40 yards of that roof line, and I had not seen it. Neither had my brother, neither, I felt sure, had my father or my grandfather. There was no road to it, there was no path, there were no tire tracks in the soft creek mud below it. It sat in a fold of the land that should have been visible from the ridge above, and it had been invisible to us for 3 decades. We worked our way down to it through the kudzu. The vines were thick, and they pulled at our ankles, and they wrapped around the saw guards, and by the time we'd cut our way to the base of the walls, we were both breathing hard. The cabin was small, smaller than ours, maybe 16 feet by 20. The walls were hand-hewn logs, dovetailed at the corners in the old way, and the chinking between them was clay and horsehair, original work. Pre-1900 work, probably. There was a single door on the front, half rotted and hanging off one leather hinge, and there were 2 small windows with the glass still intact behind a screen of vines. Cole pushed the door open with the butt of the saw. It came open with a soft scraping sound, and the smell that came out was the smell old closed places have, dust and dry rot, and a faint vegetable mustiness from the kudzu pressed against the walls. We went inside. The interior was untouched. That is the thing I keep coming back to, because we had expected, both of us, to find a wreck. We'd expected animal damage and water damage, and the kind of slow collapse 100 years of neglect should bring. What we found instead was a room that looked like the family had stepped out an hour before. The table was set for 4. Plates, cups, silverware, all laid out neatly. The plates were heavy white china, with a small blue flower painted in the middle of each one. The cups were tin. There was a serving bowl in the center of the table, with something dried and dark in the bottom of it that might have been a stew once. Everything was coated in a layer of dust, so thick it had the texture of felt, but nothing had been disturbed. No animals had been at the table. No rodents had nested in the bowl. The chairs were pushed in. 2 of them were small chairs, the kind built for children. A cast iron pot hung on its hook in the fireplace, swung out from the hearth, with a wooden spoon resting on the lip of it. There was kindling laid on the hearth, dry and ready, with a few pieces of split wood stacked beside it. There was a small braided rug on the floor in front of the fireplace, and on the rug was a child's wooden toy, a small carved horse, lying on its side as if it had been dropped. In the back of the cabin, there was a single room with 2 beds in it, 1 full-sized bed and 1 smaller bed pushed against the opposite wall. The beds were made. The quilts were folded down at the corners the way you fold them when you've finished tucking children in. On the smaller bed, laid out neatly across the foot of it, were 2 sets of children's clothes. A small dress and a small pair of overalls, washed and folded and set out for the next morning. They had not been worn in 100 years. The fabric of the dress had thinned to almost transparency along the folds, and on the wall above the fireplace, in the main room, there was a framed photograph. Cole found it before I did. I was in the back room when I heard him say my name, in a voice that didn't sound right. I came out. He was standing in front of the fireplace with the photograph in his hands. He'd lifted it off its nail. He was looking at it, and he was not moving. And when I came up beside him and looked at it too, I understood why. It was a family portrait. The kind of stiff-posed photographs people took in the 1920s and 1930s, black and white, with the family standing in a row in front of their home. A mother and a father, and 2 small children, a boy and a girl. The mother was in a dark dress with a high collar. The father was in his good clothes, suspenders and a buttoned shirt and a Sunday coat. The boy was maybe 7. The girl was maybe 5, and she was holding a small carved wooden horse in her hand. Behind them was the cabin we were standing in. The same door, the same windows, the same stone chimney rising up beside them. I recognized them. This is the part of the story I have the most trouble telling, because there is no good way to make it land the way it landed for us, standing in that dust-coated room with the photograph in my brother's hands. The 4 people in the photograph were the same 4 people in a photograph that had been on our grandfather's mantle for as long as either of us had been alive. Granddad had pointed at that photograph many times over the years, when one of us had asked, and he'd told us they were Mullinses, distant cousins on his mother's side, who had pulled up stakes and moved out to Oklahoma in 1934 when the timber work had dried up. He'd told us the family had written letters for a few years, and then stopped, the way families did in the Depression, when life got hard enough that maintaining the past became a luxury. He'd told us their names, Calvin and Eula Mullins, their boy Caleb and their girl Sarah. He'd told us this often enough that I could have recited it. They had not gone to Oklahoma. We took the photograph back to the main cabin. We walked up out of that hollow with it, wrapped in Cole's shirt, neither of us saying much. And when we got back to the main cabin, we laid the photograph on the kitchen table, next to the one from the mantel, side by side. I took our grandfather's photograph down with my hands shaking, and I put it next to the one from the hollow, and we stood over the table, and we looked at them both. The faces were the same. Not similar, the same. The same mother, with the same dark hair pulled back into the same low bun, with the same small mole on the left side of her chin. The same father, with the same heavy mustache, with the same eyes set deep under heavy brows. The same little boy. The same little girl with the same carved horse in her hand. Same clothes, even. Same dress on Eula, same suspenders on Calvin, same overalls on Caleb, same pinafore on Sarah. They had been photographed on the same day, in the same outfits, almost certainly within the same hour. In our grandfather's photograph, the family was standing in front of their cabin, in a neat row, looking at the camera, not smiling. The composition was formal. The light was even. It was the photograph that gets taken when a family commissions a photographer to come out and make a record of them, the way families did in those years before everyone had a camera. In the photograph from the hollow, the family was standing in front of their cabin too, in the same neat row, in the same clothes. But there was a difference. In front of them, at their feet, there was a hole in the ground. It had been freshly dug. The earth around it was the dark, wet color of recently turned soil, and there was a small pile of dirt to one side of it. The hole was rectangular, maybe 6 feet long and 3 feet wide, and the angle of the camera was such that you could see down into it a little way. It was the size and shape of a grave. There was only one of them, one grave for the 4 of them, and they were smiling, all 4 of them, the mother and the father and the boy and the girl. In a photograph taken on the same day as the other one, in the same clothes, by the same photographer, with the same composition, they had been smiling, and they had been standing in front of a freshly dug grave at their own feet. Cole and I stood over that table for a long time. The light through the kitchen window was the orange of a late summer afternoon, and outside the cicadas were going in the trees, the way they go in late July. And the only thing I could think about was the carved wooden horse on the rug, in the cabin, in the hollow, lying on its side, where the little girl had dropped it. We did not take the photograph back. We did not go back to the hollow. We finished our brush clearing in the other sections of the property, and we did not say anything to our grandfather about what we'd found. I want to tell you we asked him about it, but we didn't. He was 84, and his health was not good, and there was something in both of us that did not want to put him in front of those 2 photographs side by side and watch his face. We agreed without discussing it. We have not discussed it since. Granddad died in the spring of 2021. We buried him in the cemetery in town, next to our grandmother. And Cole and I inherited the property jointly, the way our father would have if he'd lived. We talked about selling the place. We talked about subdividing it and selling the lower parcels and keeping the main cabin. In the end, we did neither of those things. We kept it. We go up there still, in the summers, with our own families now, and our children fish the creek and build forts in the hollows the way we did. We do not let them go down to the lower creek. We have told them the way our grandfather must have told our father, and our father must have told us that the land in that fold is not safe to play in. We have told them the brush is too thick and the footing is bad. We have told them there are snakes. They believe us because children believe their fathers, and because the lower creek is a long walk from the main cabin, and there are better places closer to home. I went down once, alone, in the fall of 2022. I don't know why. I told myself I was going to look at the cabin one more time and see if I could make sense of it as an adult with 3 years of distance. I worked my way down through the kudzu, which had grown back over the path we'd cut in 2019. I came to the fold in the land. I stood on the ridge above the bowl and I looked down. There was no cabin. The kudzu was a smooth green carpet over the bottom of the hollow. There was no roof line, no chimney, no door. I went down to where I thought it had been, and I cut into the vines with a knife, and I found only earth and the rotted remains of what might have been a foundation a very long time ago. Some loose stones, a scattering of clay chinking, broken up and pressed into the dirt, nothing else. I drove back to the main cabin that evening. I looked at the photograph on the mantel, the one our grandfather had kept all his life, of Calvin and Eula and Caleb and Sarah Mullins standing stiff and unsmiling in front of their cabin. I looked at it for a long time. I did not take it down. I did not turn it over to see if there was anything written on the back of it that I had not seen before, because I had begun to be afraid of what I might find. I have not been back down to the lower creek since. I do not know if the cabin is gone, or if it was only hiding from me that day, or if I was hiding from it. I do not know what our grandfather knew, or how long he had known it, or why he had kept that photograph on the mantel for 60 years, looking at those 4 faces every morning of his life. I think about it most in the fall, when the light through the kitchen window goes orange in the late afternoon, and I think about the little girl with the carved horse in her hand, and I wonder, the way I have wondered every year since, who took the second photograph. I hadn't been back to my dad's hunting camp since the winter I was 12. He died that December in a way that the family never really talked about, a heart attack alone on the road between the camp and home, and after the funeral, my mother sold most of what he'd owned, the truck, the guns, his tools, anything that reminded her of him, which was almost everything. But she didn't sell the camp. The camp was on family land that had been in my father's people for 4 generations, sitting on a finger of ridge above the Bluestone River in Mercer County, and selling it would have meant talking to my father's brothers, and she could not bear to talk to my father's brothers. So she locked it up and she let it sit. For 19 years she paid the property taxes, and she did not go back, and neither did I. And the cabin stayed exactly as we'd left it the spring after he died. I was 31 years old when I drove up there in May of 2023. My mother had finally agreed to sell. She was in her late 60s, and her health had started to slip, and the money from the property would help with what was coming. She'd asked me to go up and walk through the place before we listed it. She wanted to know what was still inside, what should be kept, what should be thrown out, what should be given to family. She did not offer to come with me. I did not ask her to. The drive up was longer than I remembered, though I had been a child the last time I'd made it, and everything had been longer then. I came up out of the river valley on a road that switched back along the side of the ridge, and I turned off onto the old logging cut that my father had always called the camp road, and I drove the last 1.5 miles in low gear. The cabin came into view through the trees, and it was smaller than I remembered. The way places from childhood always are. Single story, tin roof gone to rust, a porch on the south side where my father had cleaned his rifles when I was a boy. The key still worked. My mother had given it to me in an envelope along with a hand-drawn map and a note that said, "Be careful, please." I had not asked her what she meant. I had assumed she meant the road. The inside smelled exactly the way I remembered, and the smell hit me harder than I'd expected. pine and gun oil and old wood smoke, with something underneath that was just the smell of my father, the soap he'd used, and the cologne he'd worn for church on the Sundays we'd gone. I stood in the doorway for a long time, with the key still in my hand. The light coming through the south window fell across the same scarred plank floor I'd run on as a kid. And there was his chair, the green corduroy recliner he'd hauled up from the house when I was 8, sitting in the corner by the window the way he'd left it. There was his coffee mug on the table next to the chair, the brown one with the chip in the rim. The cabin had been waiting. I sat in his chair. I want to say I cried for a while, but it was longer than a while. I sat in that chair, and I cried the way you cry when you have not let yourself cry about a thing in a long time. And when I was done, I felt hollowed out and clean, and the light through the window had moved across the floor and gone yellow with afternoon. I got up to walk the cabin. The kitchen was the way my mother and I had left it in the spring of 2004. We'd cleaned it together. I was 13 by then, and I'd done most of the wiping down, because she'd needed to sit on the porch and breathe a few times. And I remembered the kitchen counter being bare. We'd packed up the canned food and the spices into a cardboard box, and we'd taken it home with us. The counter had been wiped down with bleach water and left empty. I remembered this because I remembered being proud, in the small way 13-year-olds are proud, of having done a thorough job. There was a cassette tape on the counter. It was sitting in the middle of the kitchen counter, on a small square of dust-free formica, in the middle of 19 years of accumulated dust, as if it had been set down there sometime after the rest of the surface had stopped being touched. A black plastic cassette, the kind you could buy at any drugstore in the 90s, with a white label on the front. There was writing on the label in my father's handwriting, the looping print he'd always used for everything, the same hand I had recognized on Christmas cards and grocery lists when I was a child. The label said, "For when you're old enough." I stood at the counter, and I looked at it for a long time. I was not afraid yet. I want to be clear about that. I was confused. I was trying to fit the tape into the story of the cabin, the story of my mother, and me cleaning it in 2004, the story of 19 years of locked doors and undisturbed dust. And the tape did not fit. The counter around it was dusty. The tape was not. There were no other signs of disturbance anywhere else in the cabin that I had seen. No footprints in the dust on the floor. No fingerprints on the door handles. Nothing missing as far as I could tell from any of the shelves or the drawers. I picked the tape up. It was light in my hand. I turned it over. The other side of the label was blank. I went through the drawers in the kitchen, looking for a tape player. I remembered my father had kept one at the cabin, a small black portable model he'd used to listen to talk radio when the reception was bad, which was always. I found it in the third drawer down, next to a flashlight and a roll of electrical tape. The batteries inside were corroded. White powder caked around the contacts, and I cleaned them out with a paper towel. And I put in fresh batteries from a pack I had in my truck. The little green light came on. I slid the tape in. I held the player in my hand and I stood at the kitchen counter, and I pressed play. For a few seconds, there was only the soft hiss of blank tape. Then my father's voice came through the speaker. And it was the first time I had heard his voice in 19 years. He was sitting close to the microphone. I could tell by the way his breath came through, by the soft consonants, by the small wet sound of his mouth opening. He sounded tired. He sounded older than he should have sounded, because he had only been 44 when he died, and he sounded like a man closer to 60, and he sounded scared. I had not, in all the years of my childhood, ever heard my father sound scared, And the sound of it on that tape made something move in my chest that I did not have a name for. He said my name first. Then he said he was making the tape because he didn't know how else to tell me. He said he hoped I wouldn't hear it for a long time, that I'd find it when I was a grown man and the cabin had been sitting empty for years. Because by then, maybe whatever was in the woods would be gone. He said he was sorry he was going to scare me. He told me he'd started seeing something behind the camp in the early fall. The first time was during bow season. He'd been sitting in his tree stand on the far side of the back ridge, and he'd watched something move through the trees on the slope below him that wasn't a deer. It was upright. It was the size and shape of a tall man. It moved between the trees in a way that he could not describe, except to say that it did not move the way a man moves, that there was something wrong about the way it placed its feet. He had not gotten a clear look at its face. He had not wanted to. He had sat in that stand until full dark, and then he had walked back to the cabin with his rifle in his hands, and he had not slept that night. He said it came back. He said over the next few weeks it came closer. He started seeing it at the edge of the tree line in the evenings, when he was out behind the cabin splitting wood or coming back from the outhouse. Always at dusk, always at the edge of the trees. It would stand there at the limit of where the light still reached, and it would watch him. And when he turned his head to look at it directly, it would be gone, and he could never quite remember afterward whether he had really seen it or whether he had imagined it. He said the worst part started in October. He said it had started using voices. He said he was sitting on the porch one evening, around sundown, cleaning a rifle, when he heard my mother call his name from the tree line. He said he stood up so fast, he knocked the chair over, because my mother was not supposed to be at the cabin. She was 150 miles away, in our house in Princeton, and he had spoken to her on the phone 2 hours earlier when he'd driven into town for groceries. He said he walked to the edge of the porch with the rifle in his hand, and he called back, and there was no answer, just the woods. And then a minute later, her voice came again from a different spot along the tree line, 20 yards over, calling his name the same way. He said he did not go out to the trees. He said he went inside the cabin, and he locked the door, and he sat up all night with the rifle on his knees. He said it started using my voice next. He said he heard me calling him from the tree line one evening, in the high, clear voice I'd had when I was 11 and 12, the voice of a boy who had not yet started to change. He said it had called him Daddy, which I had not called him since I was 9. He said he had recognized something in the voice that was almost right and not quite right, the way a recording of yourself sounds wrong when you hear it played back. He said it was using my voice the way a man might use a word in a language he didn't quite speak. He said he had stood inside the cabin, behind the locked door, and listened to me call him from the woods for almost an hour, and he had wept while he listened, because part of him had wanted to go out anyway. He said this was why he was making the tape. He said he was making it for me, because he was afraid that if anything happened to him, the cabin would still be here, and one day I would be old enough to come back to it, and he wanted me to know. He said it had started calling me too. Not him calling for me. Me, my voice calling for me. He said he had heard it one evening, when I had been with him at the cabin, the previous summer, the last summer we had spent there together. I had been 11 that summer. He said I had been playing in the yard behind the cabin, throwing a tennis ball against the woodshed and catching it, the way I'd like to do, and he had been inside making supper, and he had heard my voice from the tree line, calling me by my name. He said I had not heard it because I'd been making my own noise with the ball. He said he had come out onto the porch with his heart pounding, and he had watched me playing in the yard, and he had watched the tree line behind me, and he had not seen anything. But he had heard my voice come from the trees again, calling me, and I had stopped throwing the ball, and I had turned my head toward the trees, and I had taken one step in that direction before he had called out my name from the porch, and I had run to him. He said he had not let me play outside alone again that summer. He said he had told me a story about copperheads being bad in the yard that year, and he had kept me on the porch where he could see me, and he had cut the trip short, and we had gone home a week early. I remembered that. I remembered being disappointed. I had asked him why we were leaving, and he had told me he was not feeling well, and I had believed him. He said on the tape that he was going to try to deal with the thing himself. He said he didn't know what it was, and he didn't know if it could be dealt with, but he was going to try because he was not going to let it have me. He said he loved me. He said if I was listening to this tape, it meant he had not been able to deal with it, and the cabin was still standing, and I had come back. He said he wanted me to leave before sundown. He said he wanted me to lock the door behind me and never come back, and he wanted me to tell my mother to sell the land to anyone who would buy it, and he wanted me to know that nothing in that cabin was worth a single hour after dark. The tape went quiet. I thought it was over. I almost stopped it, but then my father's voice came back, much softer, and he said one more thing. He said that whatever it was, he thought it had been getting closer to the cabin for a reason. He said he thought it had been learning. He said he thought, by the end, that it had learned him too. He said if I ever came back to the cabin and I heard his voice calling me from the trees, I was to remember that he was dead, and I was to go inside and lock the door and not come out until morning. The tape ended. The cassette clicked over. The room was very quiet. I looked down at the cassette in the player. There was a small white sticker on the back of the cassette, the kind that comes pre-printed on store-bought tapes, with the date the tape had been manufactured and a space for the user to write the date of recording. My father had written a date in the user space, in the same looping print as the label. He had written December 17, 1991. My father died on December 14, 1991. His funeral was on December 16. He was buried in the cemetery in Princeton, and I had stood by the grave in a coat, too thin for the weather, and watched my mother throw a handful of dirt onto the casket. I had been there. I knew the date. The tape had been recorded 3 days after his funeral. I stood at the kitchen counter, and I looked at that date for a long time. The light through the south window had gone the orange of late afternoon. I could hear the wind moving in the trees behind the cabin. I could hear, very faintly, a sound that might have been the creek down in the hollow, or might have been something else. I picked up the cassette, and I put it in my pocket. I picked up my keys. I walked out of the cabin, and I locked the door behind me, and I got in my truck, and I drove down the camp road, as fast as the truck would go on that gravel. I did not look in the rearview mirror. I did not look at the tree line. The sun was still up. I made it down to the highway, with the light still gold across the ridges, and I drove home, and I did not stop until I was in my own driveway in Princeton. I never went back. My mother sold the cabin and the land to a man from Roanoke, who wanted to use it as a hunting camp. And I did not warn him, because I did not know what to warn him about, and because I had begun to be afraid that if I told the story out loud to a stranger, I would have to start believing it in a way that I could not yet bear to believe it. The new owner has had the cabin for almost 3 years now. As far as I know, nothing has happened to him. As far as I know, I keep the cassette in a drawer in my bedroom. I have not listened to it again. I know that if I listen to it again, I will hear my Father's voice, and I will hear him say he loved me, and I will hear him tell me to leave before sundown, and I will hear the small sad note at the end, where he told me he was going to try to deal with it himself. Sometimes, late, I think about my father walking out into those woods on a December night in 1991, after he made that tape, with his rifle in his hand, going to try to deal with something that had learned to use my voice. I think about how he must have known, when he walked out, that he might not come back. I think about the date on the tape, and I try to make it mean something other than what it means, and I cannot. And I think about the last thing he said on the recording, the part about it, learning him by the end. And I wonder, the way I have wondered every night since I drove down that mountain, whose voice it was that recorded the tape. I bought the 20 acres in Letcher County, Kentucky, in the fall of 2020. The market had gone strange that year, the way it had for a lot of people, and I'd been looking for somewhere to disappear to for a long time before I'd had the money to actually do it. I worked remote. I was 41 and divorced, and the lease on my apartment in Lexington was up, and I'd been spending my weekends driving back roads through the eastern part of the state looking at land. The parcel I bought sat at the end of a county road that turned to gravel 2 miles before the property line, and the gravel turned to packed dirt for the last quarter mile. There was an old cabin already standing on the lot, single story, maybe 900 square feet, with a stone foundation and a tin roof and a cellar entrance on the north side of the building. The asking price for the whole parcel, including the structure, was less than what a one-bedroom condo in Lexington would have cost. The seller was an estate lawyer named Hollis Combs out of Whitesburg. He was an older man, with a careful, formal way of talking, the kind of lawyer who'd practiced in small towns long enough that he didn't bother trying to sound like a city lawyer anymore. He explained the situation in his office. The previous owner of the property had been a man named Ellis Sturgill, who had bought the land in the early 90s and built the cabin himself. Sturgill had gone missing in 2005, walked out of the cabin one morning, and never come back. And after 15 years, the family had finally been able to petition the court to have him declared dead in absentia so the estate could be settled. There were no heirs who wanted the property. The family had liquidated everything they could and put the cabin on the market. I asked Hollis if the cabin had been lived in since Sturgill had disappeared. He told me no. He told me the family had checked on it a few times in the early years, but after the declaration of death, they'd boarded up the windows and locked the doors and left it alone. He said the place would need some work. I told him I was planning to gut it anyway. He nodded the way men nod when they're not going to argue with another man's plans, and we shook hands. And a week later, I had the keys. I drove out to take possession on a Saturday in early November. The road in was beautiful in a stark late fall way, the leaves mostly down, the ridges showing their bones, the smell of wood smoke in the air from somewhere I couldn't see. The cabin sat in a small clearing, maybe an acre wide, with the woods rising up steep behind it. There was a woodshed on the east side, and a small fenced garden plot, gone to weeds on the west, and the cellar door on the north side, set into the slope, with a slanted wooden bulkhead that had weathered to gray. I parked my truck, and I got out, and I stood there in the clearing for a minute, taking it in. It was mine. The whole thing was mine. I unlocked the front door, and I went inside. The first thing I noticed was the smell. Not the smell of a cabin that had been closed up for 15 years. The smell of a cabin that was being lived in. The faint trace of cooking, of wood smoke from a recent fire, of a man's body and his soap, and the small everyday smells of habitation. The air inside was warmer than the air outside, the way the air in a closed house is warmer when there's been a fire burning in it within the last day or two. I stood in the doorway with my bag in my hand, and I looked at the room in front of me, and I tried to understand what I was looking at. The kitchen was clean. Not the kind of clean a place gets when no one has touched it in 15 years. The kind of clean a place gets when someone wipes the counters every morning. The formica was wiped down. The sink was dry, but the drain ring was free of any kind of buildup. The trash can in the corner had a fresh black plastic bag in it, empty, hanging neatly inside the rim. I walked over to the refrigerator. I opened it. The bulb was out, but in the light coming through the kitchen window, I could see there was food inside. A carton of milk, half full, a package of sliced bread, a jar of peanut butter with the seal broken. I picked up the milk carton, and I turned it to read the date stamp. The milk was 2 days from expiring. I set the milk back in the refrigerator, and I closed the door, and I went through the rest of the cabin slowly. The main room had a wood stove, and the wood stove was cold, but the ashes inside were soft and recent. There was a small splitting maul leaned against the wall next to the stove, with fresh wood shavings still clinging to the head. In the back room, there was a bed, a double bed with a metal frame, and the bed was made. The sheets were clean. The blanket was folded down at the foot of the mattress with the precision of someone who'd been in the military. There was a pillow at the head of the bed, and the pillow had an indentation in it the shape of a head. I went back out to my truck. I sat in the driver's seat, and I called Hollis Combs. He answered on the second ring. I told him what I was seeing. I described the milk and the made bed and the warm ash. He listened without interrupting, and when I was done, he was quiet for a moment, and then he told me, in the same careful, formal voice he'd used in his office, that no one had been inside that cabin in years. He said it with the certainty of a man who had handled the property for the last decade and a half. He said the family had checked on it once, 2 years ago, before petitioning the court, and that they'd found it boarded and undisturbed. He said the keys had been in his office safe ever since. He told me to call the sheriff's department if I was concerned, and that he'd be available to confirm any details with them. He sounded like he believed himself. I told him I'd handle it. I hung up. I didn't call the sheriff. I should have. I've thought about that a lot since. But I sat in my truck, and I looked at the cabin in the November afternoon light. And I told myself it was probably a squatter, some local who'd known the place was empty and had been crashing there off and on, and that I didn't want to start my new life on this land by getting some down-on-his-luck mountain man arrested and making enemies of every one of his cousins. I told myself I'd change the locks and post some signs, and that would be the end of it. I drove into Whitesburg, and I bought new locks at the hardware store, 2 of them, a deadbolt and a knob lock for the front door, and a separate bolt for the back. I drove back. I installed them myself in the fading light. I tested each one. I locked the door behind me when I was finished. I made dinner on a camp stove in the kitchen because I didn't trust the wood stove yet, and I went to bed in the back room with the door bolted and a hatchet on the floor next to the mattress. I woke at dawn. The cabin was cold. I got up and I walked through to the kitchen, and I went to the front door because I had wanted to step outside and see the property in the morning light. The deadbolt was unlocked. The knob lock was unlocked. I had locked both of them the night before. I had tested them. I stood there in my socks, looking at the brand new hardware I had installed 8 hours earlier, and I felt the small cold feeling at the back of my neck that I would come to know well in the months that followed. I checked the cabin. Nothing was missing. Nothing was disturbed. My bag was where I'd left it. My laptop was on the kitchen table where I'd set it down the night before. The cash in my wallet was untouched. I walked through every room. The bed in the back was still made, the blanket folded down the way I'd folded it down. The wood stove was cold. The cellar door, which I had locked separately from the outside, with a padlock when I'd gotten the property, was still padlocked. Everything was the way I had left it. With one exception, in the kitchen sink, there were 2 coffee cups. I had used 1 cup the night before. I had washed it and set it upside down on the drying rack next to the sink before bed, because that's the way I'd been raised to leave a kitchen. The cup was no longer on the drying rack. It was in the sink. Next to it, in the sink, was a second cup, the same model, from the cabinet above the stove. Both cups had a small ring of coffee residue in the bottom. They had been used. They had been set in the sink together, the way 2 people might set their cups in the sink at the end of breakfast. I want to tell you that I left then. I want to tell you that I packed my truck and I drove back to Lexington, and I called Hollis Combs from the road, and I told him to sell the place to someone else. But I didn't. I am not a man who scares easy, and I had sunk a significant amount of money into this property. And there is a kind of stubbornness that gets into a man when he has signed a deed. I told myself there had to be an explanation. I told myself the locks must have been defective. I drove back into town, and I bought a different brand of deadbolt and a different brand of knob lock. And I bought 4 game cameras of the kind hunters use, the trail cam type that snaps a photograph anytime motion crosses the sensor. I drove back. I installed the new locks. I installed the cameras on trees around the property. 1 pointed at the front door, 1 at the back, 1 at the cellar bulkhead, 1 at the gap in the tree line where the back path came up from the creek. 3 nights, the cameras caught nothing. I checked them every morning. Empty frames, deer at twilight, a raccoon. The locks held. Nothing was disturbed. I started to relax. I started to think I had been paranoid, that the coffee cups had been some trick of my own tired memory after a long drive and a strange first day in a strange place. I started to settle in. On the 4th night, the back path camera caught something. I was eating breakfast when I checked the SD cards that morning, and I pulled up the file from the back path camera, and there was a single sequence of photographs, time-stamped, at 3:14 in the morning. The camera had taken 7 photographs in a span of maybe 8 seconds as the figure had passed through the sensor's field of view. The figure was tall and thin. It walked with a slight limp, favoring the right leg. It was coming up the back path from the creek, into the clearing, and the photographs caught it from behind and slightly to the side, so I could see the shape of it, but not the face. It was wearing a brown canvas jacket. I knew that jacket. It was the canvas jacket I had brought with me from Lexington, the one I had hung on the hook by the front door when I'd moved in. It was wearing my boots, the brown work boots I had brought up with me, the ones I had been planning to wear that morning to walk the property. I had not worn them the night before. I had left them by the door. The figure in the photograph was wearing my clothes, and it was walking up the path past the woodshed. And the last photograph in the sequence caught it disappearing around the corner of the cabin, heading toward the cellar door on the north side. I went to the closet. My jacket was gone. My boots were gone. The hook by the door was empty. The boot tray was empty. I had not heard a single sound the night before. I had slept through the entire thing. I want to tell you what I did then in some kind of order. But the morning after that 4th night is fragmented in my memory, and I am not sure of the sequence. I know, I called the sheriff. I know 2 deputies came out within the hour. An older man and a younger man. And they listened to me, and they looked at the photographs on the camera screen, and the older one's face did something when he saw the figure walking past the woodshed. He went and got bolt cutters from his cruiser. They cut the padlock off the cellar door. The cellar was the original stone-walled root cellar that Sturgill had built when he'd built the cabin. It was maybe 10 feet by 12, with a packed dirt floor and shills along the walls. In the back corner, in the spot farthest from the bulkhead door, was a bed. A real bed, a mattress on a low frame, with blankets and a pillow. Next to the bed was a small camping lantern, and a stack of paperback books, and a 5-gallon bucket that had been used as a toilet. There was a hot plate. There were canned goods on the shelves, neatly arranged, the kind of canned goods someone had laid in over a long time. There was a small mirror on a nail in the wall, and a comb and a toothbrush on the shelf below it. There was no one in the cellar when the deputies opened it. There was no one in the cabin. The figure in my jacket and my boots was not on the property anywhere we could find, and the deputies and I walked the woods for 3 hours, and we did not find him. The older deputy told me, quietly, while the younger one was still searching the woodline, that the cellar setup looked like it had been there a long time. Years, he said, not weeks, years. He said the canned goods had labels from several different decades. He said the mattress was old enough to have a print pattern that hadn't been sold in a long time. He said, in his opinion, someone had been living down there, off and on, for a considerable period, and that the someone had likely been there before I'd bought the property, and likely been there during the entire time the property had sat empty after Sturgill had disappeared. I asked him if he thought it was Sturgill. He didn't answer me for a long moment. Then he told me that he'd been a deputy in this county in 2005, when Sturgill had gone missing, and that he'd been one of the men who'd searched the woods after the family had reported him gone. He told me they'd never found a body. He told me he had always wondered. And then he told me, with the kind of tired honesty that older country deputies sometimes have, that he did not think I should plan to stay on the property. I packed my truck. I drove back to Lexington that afternoon. I left the cabin to Hollis Combs, who agreed to find another buyer, and the property was eventually sold to a young couple from Cincinnati, who I believe still own it. I did not warn them. I did not know what to warn them about. I do not know if the man in my jacket ever came back. I do not know if he had been in the cellar the entire month I had been sleeping above him, listening through the floorboards to my movements, learning my habits, taking my coffee cup out of the rack at night and washing it and setting it back the next morning. I do not know if he was Sturgill, or if he was someone who had found Sturgill, or if he was something else entirely that I do not have a name for. I do not know whose milk was in the refrigerator when I arrived, or who had wiped down the counters, or whose head had pressed the indentation into the pillow on the bed. I do not know how long he had been there before I came, and I do not know if he is there still. I think about the made bed in the back room sometimes. I think about how a man living in a cellar might come up at night, while the new owner was away in Lexington signing the deed, and might make the bed in the room above his head, and might put fresh milk in the refrigerator, and might wipe down the counters, the way a man prepares a house for a guest he has been waiting for. I think about how, after the deputies and I had searched the cellar and the woods, I had gone back inside the cabin one last time to gather my things, and I had walked through to the back room, and I had stood looking at the bed I had been sleeping in for a month, the bed someone had made up for me before I'd arrived. The pillow with the indentation on the morning I had first walked into the cabin had been on the right side of the bed. I had been sleeping on the left side for a month. I think about that some nights when I cannot sleep, and I wonder whose head the indentation had been waiting for. My wife Margaret and I had been married 11 years when we drove down to the Nantahala in October of 2018 for what we'd planned as a long weekend of hiking. We were both in our late 30s then, both office workers, both the kind of people who tell themselves every year that they're going to spend more time outdoors and then don't. The trip had been Margaret's idea. She'd grown up in western North Carolina, in a small town outside Murphy, and she'd been on the trails in the Nantahala as a girl with her father. She wanted to show me the country she remembered. I had agreed because I loved her, and because the photographs she'd shown me of the place had been beautiful, and because in 11 years of marriage, I had learned that her ideas were almost always better than mine. We drove down on a Friday afternoon, and we got a room at a small inn near Topton. We hiked an easy loop that evening before sundown, just to stretch our legs and get a feel for the country. The mountains there are different from the mountains farther north. They are older, the slopes are softer, and the hollows are deeper. And there is a particular kind of stillness in the woods at dusk that I had not encountered before, a quality of quiet that does not feel empty so much as inhabited. Margaret felt it too. She didn't say so, but I could tell by the way. She walked closer to me than usual on the trail, and by the way, she did not let go of my hand, even when the path widened. The next morning, we drove to the trailhead for a longer hike, a route Margaret had picked out the night before, from a map the innkeeper had given us. It was supposed to be a 6-mile loop with a waterfall at the midpoint and a return along a ridgeline that the map promised would have views. The trail was poorly marked from the start. The blazes were faded and not always visible, and at one point we walked for half an hour before realizing we hadn't seen a blaze in any direction. We backtracked. We found the trail again, or thought we had. We kept on. I do not know exactly when we lost the trail for good. I know that around 2 in the afternoon, Margaret said she didn't recognize anything on the map, and I know that by 3, we had stopped pretending we knew where we were, and I know that by 4 the light was starting to fade, in the way the light fades in October when the sun goes behind a ridge 2 hours before it actually sets. We had water, and we had a small bag of trail mix, and we had the clothes on our backs, and we did not have cell signal, and we did not have a flashlight beyond the small one on my keychain, and we did not have any clear idea of which direction the road was. We pushed through what felt like uphill, but might not have been, bushwhacking through laurel that grew thicker the deeper we went, and we tried not to panic. I want to give Margaret credit here, because she was the one who kept us moving. I had started to make the kind of small, unhelpful sounds men make when they are scared, and trying not to admit it. And she had taken my hand, and she had said we were going to be fine, and the firmness of her voice had pulled me back from the edge of something I had been about to fall into. That was when we came out into the clearing. It was small, maybe 1/3 of an acre, set in a shallow bowl between 2 slopes. The trees opened up the way they sometimes do, where the land has been worked at some point in the past, where someone had pulled out the stumps and let the grass grow. And in the middle of the clearing there was a cabin. It was small, perhaps 400 square feet, built of dark wood that had weathered almost to black with age. A stone chimney rose up the east wall, and from the chimney came a thin, steady ribbon of wood smoke. The 2 windows on the front of the cabin glowed yellow with the warm interior light of oil lamps. There was a small covered porch on the front, with a single wooden chair on it. An old man was sitting in the chair. He saw us as we came out of the trees. He raised one hand in a wave that was somehow both casual and welcoming, the wave of a man who was not surprised to see anyone come out of the woods at the end of a long day, and who had time for whoever showed up. Margaret and I stopped at the edge of the clearing. I think we were both prepared to apologize and ask for directions and move on. But the old man stood up from his chair, and he came to the railing of the porch, and he called across to us in a voice that carried easily in the clearing, and he asked us if we were lost. We told him we were. He nodded as if this confirmed something he had already known. He told us the light would be gone in less than an hour, and that the trail we needed was a good 1.5 miles away, through country we did not know, and that we would not make it before dark. He told us we were welcome to come up and wait out the night by his fire, and that he would set us right in the morning. He said it plainly, without any flourish, the way a man might offer a neighbor a cup of coffee. I looked at Margaret. Margaret looked at me. We did not speak, but I could see her thinking what I was thinking, which was that this was the kind of offer that any sensible person in any other context would be cautious about. A stranger, a remote cabin, two people no one knew the location of, but there was nothing in the old man's manner that set off any of the alarms a person carries for situations like this. He was old, maybe in his 70s, with a soft round face and white hair under a wool cap, and his hands resting on the porch rail were the hands of a man who had worked all his life. His voice had a calm in it that was almost paternal, and we were tired, and we were cold, and the alternative was a night in the woods without flashlights or sleeping bags. We thanked him. We walked up to the cabin. His name, he told us, when we stepped onto the porch, was Eldon. He shook my hand with a grip that was firm but not aggressive, and he tipped his cap to Margaret, and he opened the door of the cabin and ushered us inside the way a host does. The interior of the cabin was a single room, with a low ceiling and pine plank walls, and a stone fireplace taking up most of one wall, with a fire already burning in it. There was a small table with 2 chairs. There was a narrow bed in the corner, with a quilt folded at the foot. There was a rocking chair near the fire, the light from 2 oil lamps, and the fire itself filled the room with a warmth that was the most welcome thing I had ever felt. Eldon set us by the fire. He moved with the slow, deliberate movements of an old man who has lived alone long enough that he doesn't rush for anyone. He had a pot of stew already simmering on a hook over the fire, and he ladled out 2 bowls for us, and he handed Margaret a wooden spoon to stir hers with, because the broth had settled, and the meat had sunk to the bottom of the bowl. The spoon was hand-carved, the head of it darkened with use, the handle worn smooth by years of being held. Margaret thanked him for it. He said it was nothing. The stew was good. I want to say that because I have thought about it many times since. It was venison and root vegetables, and a broth thick enough to coat the spoon, and it tasted the way food tastes when you have not eaten in many hours, and the cook has been making the same recipe for a long time. We ate 2 bowls each. Eldon ate 1. He sat in his rocking chair and he watched the fire. And he asked us small questions about where we were from and what we did for a living, and he listened to our answers with the patient attention of someone for whom company was a rare thing. He told us a little about himself. He said he had lived in the cabin a long time. He said his people had been in the area for several generations, and he had stayed when the rest of them had moved on. He said he did not get down to town often. He did not ask us for our last names, and we did not ask him for his. When the fire had burned low, he made up a bed for us on the floor in front of the hearth, with quilts laid out one on top of the other, so the floorboards wouldn't be too hard, and he put another log on the fire, and he went to his own bed in the corner, and he turned the oil lamps down low. Margaret and I lay on the quilts, and we held each other, and we did not talk for a long time. The fire crackled. The cabin smelled of wood smoke and stew and old wood. We slept. In the morning, Eldon was already up when we woke. He had made coffee in a percolator on the fire, and he had biscuits in a Dutch oven on the hearth, and he served us breakfast on tin plates, and he poured the coffee into tin cups, and he sat with us at the small table while we ate. He drew us a map on the back of a piece of brown paper with a pencil that he sharpened with a small pocket knife as he worked. He showed us the way down to the trail we had lost. He told us it was easier than it sounded. He told us to follow the small creek east until we hit a wider creek, and to follow the wider creek south until we came out on a Forest Service road, and to follow the road downhill until we hit the highway. We thanked him. We thanked him in the way you thank someone when you know that what they have done for you is the difference between a memory and an emergency. Margaret hugged him. He seemed mildly surprised by the hug and then pleased by it, and he patted her on the shoulder the way a grandfather might. As we were leaving, she realized she still had the wooden spoon in her hand. She'd been holding it without thinking. She tried to give it back to him. He told her to keep it. He said it was a small thing, and she would think of him when she used it. She put it in her pack. We followed his directions. They were exactly right. We came out on the Forest Service road within 2 hours, and we came out on the highway within 3, and we were back at the inn by lunchtime, and we drove down to the Nantahala Visitor Center that afternoon because Margaret wanted to send Eldon a thank you card. She wanted to mail it to him, or arrange to leave it with the ranger station, or do something to express what she could not quite put words to about the kindness of a stranger to 2 lost people on a cold October night. The ranger at the visitor center was a man in his 50s named Patterson. He listened to Margaret describe the cabin and the old man and the location as best as we could place it on the regional map he spread across his counter. He listened patiently at first. Then gradually his face changed. He stopped asking the clarifying questions a ranger might ask about a structure on federal land. He went very still. When Margaret had finished talking, he asked us to wait a moment, and he went into a back office, and he came out a few minutes later with a thick binder under his arm. He took us to a small room off the main visitor area, the kind of room rangers use for emergency briefings and family notifications. He closed the door. He sat us down at a small table, and he set the binder in front of us. The binder was full of photographs in plastic sleeves, organized chronologically with handwritten captions in faded ink. It was a record, he told us quietly, of the structures that had once stood on the federal land within the boundaries of the national forest, cabins and homesteads and tenant houses that had been bought out or condemned or destroyed when the forest had been expanded over the decades. He had been maintaining the binder himself for 20 years. He flipped through it slowly. Then he stopped at a page near the back, and he turned it around so we could see, and he asked us if this was the cabin. It was the cabin. Identical. The dark wood walls, the stone chimney, the single wooden chair on the small covered porch, the 2 windows on the front, the clearing around it even, the small bowl in the land that I had recognized as we'd walked up to it. The photograph was black and white. It had been taken, according to the caption in the lower margin, in Patterson's careful hand, in the spring of 1981. There was an old man in the photograph. He was standing on the porch with his hand on the rail. He was wearing a wool cap. His face was round and soft, and even in the black and white photograph, I could see the calm in his eyes. It was Eldon, not a man who looked like Eldon. Eldon, the same face we had eaten breakfast across from that morning, the same hands resting on the porch rail. Margaret made a sound. It wasn't a word. Patterson did not look at her. He was looking at the photograph too, with the particular expression of a man who had not, in his career, often had occasion to share what was in his binder with the people who had come into his office. He turned the page. There was another photograph, a photograph of the same clearing, taken from the same angle, but in this one, there was no cabin. There was a black scar of burned earth. There were charred timbers. The caption read, August 1983. Patterson told us what he knew. The old man's name had been Eldon Greer. He had lived alone in the cabin for over 40 years. He had been the last of an old family that had homesteaded the hollow in the 1880s and had gradually sold off or lost their other parcels through the 20th century. Eldon had refused to sell when the forest had expanded around him in the 60s. He had been allowed to stay. He had been a quiet man, Patterson said, and the rangers of that era had checked on him from time to time, and he had been known to take in lost hikers occasionally and feed them and send them on their way the next morning. The cabin had burned in August of 1983. Lightning, the investigators had concluded. Eldon had died in the fire. He had been 73 years old. Patterson said the family had never rebuilt. There had been no family by then. The land had reverted to the forest. The clearing had been left alone. No structure had stood there in 35 years. We drove home the next day. Neither of us spoke much. Margaret kept her hand on her pack for most of the drive, where the wooden spoon was wrapped in a sock at the top. When we got back to our house, she took it out, and she washed it in the kitchen sink, and she stood at the counter for a long time, holding it in her hand. The handle was worn smooth from a man's grip. The head was darkened from being dipped in stew. It was real. It was as real as the table she was leaning against. She put it in a drawer. We have not used the wooden spoon. We have not thrown it away. It is in the same drawer in our kitchen where Margaret put it 8 years ago, wrapped in a clean cloth, with the other things in our house that we do not know what to do with. Sometimes I open the drawer to get something else, and I see the bundle, and I close the drawer again. Margaret does the same. We do not talk about it. We talked about it for a few weeks after we came home, and then we stopped because there was nothing useful to say. We do not know what we ate that night. We do not know whose hands stirred the stew before Margaret's. We do not know if Eldon Greer was kind to lost hikers in 1981 and continued to be kind to lost hikers after the cabin burned down with him in it, or if what we met was something else that had learned to wear his shape because his shape had been kind. I want to believe the first one. I want to believe that there are some men who are so much themselves, so much of a place, that even fire cannot fully unmake them. I want to believe that a man who fed strangers from his pot in life would go on feeding them after, because that was simply who he was, and that there is a mercy in that, even if there is also something in it that we are not meant to understand. But I think about the spoon in the drawer. I think about it more than I should, and sometimes I think about going back, of driving down to the Nantahala in October, and walking into the woods until I find the clearing again, and seeing whether the cabin is there or whether it isn't, and whether Eldon Greer is sitting on the porch or whether he isn't, and what it would mean to know either way. I have not gone. Margaret has asked me not to. She has said, only once, that some kindnesses are not meant to be tested twice. I think she is right, but I think about it. I think about it most in October, when the light goes gold across the ridges and the wood smoke smell drifts in from somewhere I cannot see. I carried rural mail in Pocahontas County, West Virginia, for 22 years before I retired in 2019. I started the route in the spring of 1997 when I was 28 years old, and the previous carrier had taken his pension early, and I worked the same loop every weekday for more than 2 decades. 240-some boxes, 1,100 miles a week. The kind of job that becomes a marriage between a man and a piece of country, where you know which mailboxes lean which way after a hard winter, and which dogs will run at the truck, and which ones will only bark, and which old women will wave from the porch, and which old men will not. The route ran out from the post office in Marlinton, up through the high country toward the Greenbrier Divide, and the last stop on the whole route was a cabin on Hollow Ridge Road. The road itself was 11 miles of gravel that climbed up the side of a long ridge through second-growth timber, and the cabin sat at the very end of it, in a small clearing where the road simply stopped. There was no house beyond it. The cabin had been my last delivery from the day I'd taken the route, and it stayed my last delivery until the day I retired. The man who lived there was named Eldon Pritchard. I knew his name because it was on the mailbox at the bottom of Hollow Ridge Road, painted in white letters on the side of an old galvanized box that someone had set on a post a long time before I'd started the route. But the post office didn't deliver to that box. Eldon had arranged, sometime before my time, for his mail to be brought all the way up to the cabin. There was an extra fee for it, a few dollars a month, and the previous carrier had passed the arrangement on to me my first week. I had asked why. He'd said Eldon paid for the service and didn't want to come down the mountain, and that was all the reason I needed. In my 22 years on that route, I delivered to Eldon's cabin maybe 90 or 100 times. He didn't get much mail. Bills, mostly. The power company. The phone company in the years when he still had a landline, until the line went out sometime in the early 2000s and he didn't have it restored. Property tax notices in October. Church newsletters from the Methodist congregation down in Hillsboro every other month. A small handful of personal letters over the years, always from the same address in Ohio, a sister or a cousin, I assumed. That was it. 4 deliveries a year, sometimes 5, never more than 6. He never came to the door. The arrangement was this. He kept a metal box on the porch, a black tin box maybe the size of a bread loaf with a hinged lid. When I came up with mail, I'd put the new mail inside the box. There would always be a note waiting for me inside, folded neatly, sitting on top of any outgoing mail he wanted me to take down to the post office. The note would say something like, "Thank you kindly for the delivery. Hope this finds you well, Eldon." Sometimes it would mention the weather. Sometimes, in the fall, it would mention that the leaves were turning. The handwriting was careful and old-fashioned, the kind of cursive a man would have learned in a one-room school in the 1940s. The loops even, and the letters slanted forward in a steady, patient hand. The notes were always polite. Never long. I never saw him. I want to be clear about that. I delivered to that cabin for 19 years, and I never once saw Eldon Pritchard. I never heard his voice. I never saw a shadow move behind the curtains. I never saw a light on in the windows, though I only ever delivered during daylight hours. The cabin was always the same when I drove up. Tidy, quiet, the porch swept. The metal box on the small table by the door. Smoke sometimes from the chimney in the colder months, which was the only sign that anyone lived there at all. I'd put the mail in the box, take out the note and the outgoing mail, get back in my truck, and drive the 11 miles back down Hollow Ridge Road. I asked about him in town a few times over the years, the kind of casual asking a mailman does, at the diner where he eats lunch, or at the post office during morning sorting. Nobody seemed to know him well. The older folks said the Pritchards had been an old family in the county, and that Eldon was the last of them, a quiet man who'd lived alone up there since his mother died sometime in the 70s. The younger folks didn't know him at all. The Methodist minister, when I'd asked him once, had said Eldon had been on the church's mailing list for as long as he'd been at the church, and that he didn't think Eldon had ever attended a service. He had said it without judgment, the way country ministers sometimes say things, leaving room for a man to have his reasons. I kept the notes. I want to explain why, because looking back I am not sure I can explain it well. I kept them at first, because the first one had touched me. I was new on the route, 28 years old, and the careful handwriting and the thank you in the note had struck me as the kind of gentleness you don't expect from a stranger you've never met. I put it in my shirt pocket and I took it home, and I set it in a small wooden box on my dresser. The next time I went up there was a similar note, and I kept that one too, and after a few years, I started putting them in a shoebox in my closet, because the wooden box on the dresser had filled up. By the time I retired, I had 97 of them. I had counted once on a slow Sunday. 97 small folded notes in a shoebox, every one of them with the same careful slanted handwriting on the inside. In my 20th year on the route, in the early summer of 2017, I drove up Hollow Ridge Road on a Tuesday morning with a property tax notice and a church newsletter for Eldon Pritchard. And I came up out of the last switchback into the clearing, and I stopped my truck. The cabin was wrong. The metal box was not on the porch. The small table where it had always sat was bare. The porch itself looked different in a way I couldn't immediately name, and then I named it, which was that the porch had not been swept. There were leaves on it from the previous fall, and pine needles, and a small drift of debris in the corner where the porch met the wall. The cabin had never looked like that in 19 years. The front door was standing open. It was open maybe a foot, not all the way, with the dark of the inside showing through the gap. I sat in my truck for a minute with the engine running, and I looked at that open door. I want to tell you I was afraid in a clear way, but it wasn't that. It was a confused feeling, a feeling that something I had counted on as a fixed point in the geography of my work had shifted. I had delivered to that cabin 100 times. The door had never been open. The porch had never been unswept. The metal box had always been on the table. I got out of the truck. I called out Eldon's name. My voice sounded strange in the clearing, too loud, the way your voice sounds in a place that has been silent for a long time. There was no answer. I walked up to the porch. I called again. Nothing. I pushed the door open and I stepped inside. The cabin was empty. Not lived in empty. Empty, empty. There was no furniture. There was no rug on the floor. There were no curtains on the windows. There was no stove, and no refrigerator, and no kitchen table. There was nothing on the walls. The floorboards were covered in a layer of dust so thick that my boots left clear prints in it as I walked, and the dust was not disturbed by any other prints. The corners of the rooms were heavy with cobwebs, the kind of cobwebs that only build up over many years, gray and dense, and shrouding the joists in the ceiling. The smell in the cabin was the smell of a place that had been closed up for decades, dry and stale, with something underneath it that was faintly worse. The smell of something that had been dead a long time ago, and had only the ghost of its smell left. The fireplace had no ashes in it. The hearth was cold and gray and undisturbed. There was a small bird's nest in the chimney that I could see from below, fallen partway down, the dried weave of it gone brown with age. I walked through every room. The cabin had a main room, a kitchen, and a small bedroom at the back. The bedroom had no bed. The kitchen had no sink, though there was a place on the wall where a sink had once been mounted, with the rough cuts in the wall and the capped pipes still visible. There was nothing in any of the rooms. There was no sign that anyone had lived there in a very long time. There was no sign that anyone had been there in a very long time. The only footprints in the dust were mine. I went back outside. I stood on the porch, and I looked at the clearing. The grass was high. The path I'd walked to the porch was the only disturbance in it. There was no sign of recent foot traffic. There was no woodpile, though I could remember in some part of my mind that there had always been a woodpile against the east wall of the cabin, neatly stacked, replenished from year to year. There was nothing against the east wall now but the wall itself. I drove back down Hollow Ridge Road slowly. My hands on the wheel were not quite steady. When I got back to the post office in Marlinton, I went into the supervisor's office and I told her what I'd seen. She looked at me for a moment with the careful expression a supervisor uses with a longtime employee who has come in saying something strange. Then she picked up the phone and she called the sheriff. The sheriff's deputy who came out was a younger man named Beard, and he drove me back up Hollow Ridge Road in his cruiser. He walked through the cabin with me. He took photographs. He shone his flashlight into the corners. He looked at the dust on the floor, and he looked at my boot prints in the dust. And he asked me a few times to confirm what I had been telling him, which was that I had been delivering mail to this cabin for 19 years, and that someone had been receiving it and leaving thank you notes for me. Beard ran the property through the county records that afternoon. He came to my house that evening to tell me what he'd found. He sat in my kitchen with his hat on the table, and he told me, as gently as he could, that according to the county, there had never been anyone named Eldon Pritchard who had owned that cabin. The cabin had belonged to a family named Brackenridge, who had owned it from the 1920s until 1971, when the last Brackenridge had died, and the property had reverted to the state for back taxes. The state had never sold it. The cabin had been abandoned since 1971. There were no utility records for it. After that year, there were no property tax payments. There was no Eldon Pritchard listed in any county record, ever, in any decade. Beard asked me if I still had any of the thank you notes. I went and got the shoebox from the closet. I brought it out to the kitchen table, and I set it down in front of him, and I lifted the lid, and I picked up the top note, and I unfolded it to show him. The note was blank. The paper was the same paper I remembered, the same small fold square of plain white stationery, folded the same way, with the same crease down the middle. But there was no writing on it. The inside was a clean white surface, untouched. I sat down. I picked up another note from the box. I unfolded it. Blank. I picked up another. Blank. I picked up half a dozen at random, from different parts of the shoebox, working my way through 19 years of careful slanted cursive, and every single one of them was blank. Empty paper, nothing on either side. The folds were perfect. The papers had the same faint yellowing that paper gets when it has been sitting in a closet for a long time. But there was no handwriting on any of them. There never had been. Beard sat across from me at the kitchen table, and he watched me unfold those notes, one after another. And he did not say anything until I had unfolded maybe 30 of them. Then he put his hand on top of the shoebox, gently, and he told me I didn't have to keep looking. He told me he believed me. He told me he had been a deputy in the county for 12 years, and that he had heard stranger things, and that he was not going to write in his report that I had imagined anything. He said the cabin had been undisturbed. He said the bills the post office had been delivering had been real bills, paid for and stamped and recorded. He said the mail had been going somewhere, and he did not know where, and he did not think anyone would ever be able to tell me. I asked him about the outgoing mail. I asked him about the letters I had carried down the mountain for 19 years, the bill payments that had gone out in their envelopes, the responses to the sister or the cousin in Ohio. He told me he didn't know. He told me he would look into it, but that he didn't expect to find anything. He didn't. I worked the route for 2 more years. The cabin stayed empty. I did not deliver to it again. The mail that had been addressed to Eldon Pritchard stopped coming. The bills stopped. The church newsletter stopped. When I called the church and let them know the address was no longer current, the sister or the cousin in Ohio sent 2 more letters in the first 6 months and then stopped. I do not know what she was told. I do not know if she was ever told anything. I retired in the spring of 2019. I kept the shoebox of blank notes. It is still in my closet. I have taken it out a few times over the years, and I have unfolded a few of the notes, and they are still blank, and they will always be blank, and I do not know what they were when I held them in my hands at Eldon Pritchard's porch in the summer light and read the words written on them. I read those words. I remember them. I remember the careful slant of the cursive and the small grace notes about the weather and the always polite thank you that closed each one. I remember reading the word Eldon at the bottom of every note, in the same patient hand, 97 times over 19 years. I think about the man who wrote them sometimes. I think about him most in the autumn, when the leaves are turning the way he used to mention in his October notes. I do not know who he was, or where he wrote from, or why he chose me to be the man who carried his bills up an empty road for 19 years to a cabin that no one had lived in since 1971. I do not know if he was lonely, or if he was waiting for something, or if he simply needed someone to come up the mountain 4 times a year so that the road would not be forgotten entirely. I do not know if he is still there in some way that I do not have a word for, or if my retirement was the end of whatever he had been doing. I hope in the quiet way you hope things you cannot say out loud that he was not unhappy. I hope the thank yous were real, in whatever way they were real, and that the small kindness of them was not wasted on a man who put them in a shoebox and kept them for 20 years without knowing what he was keeping. I have not gone back to Hollow Ridge Road. I drive past the turnoff sometimes when I am running errands, and I look up the gravel track where it disappears into the trees, and I do not turn. I do not know what I would find at the top. I am not afraid of what I would find. I think I am afraid of what I would not find, which is the porch I remember, and the small table, and the metal box, and the careful note waiting inside, folded the way it was always folded, with words on it that no one else could ever read.